Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Those words, innocently spoken by Professor Harlow during my library orientation, now haunted me as I hunched over ancient manuscripts in the farthest corner of Blackfield University's historical archives. The oldest building on campus, Bournemouth Library, stood as a monument to Victorian architecture with its soaring arches and labyrinthine stacks. As the new doctoral candidate in historical linguistics, I had been granted after-hours access to the restricted collections, a privilege I both cherished and, increasingly, questioned. The brass wall clock ticked methodically, marking 3 in the morning. Outside, rain lashed against the stained glass windows, distorting the moonlight into fragmented patterns across the oak floors. I rubbed my eyes, exhausted from hours of translating forgotten languages. My research focused on marginalia, the notes scribbled in the borders of medieval texts by students hundreds of years ago, voices from the past preserved in ink and parchment. Perhaps that's why I first dismissed the sound as imagination, a whisper so faint it might have been nothing more than the pages settling under my fingertips. But then it came again, clearer this time. Help me finish it. I straightened, casting my gaze around the empty reading room. The words had been distinct, not the random creaking of an old building, but articulated syllables formed by human vocal cords. Yet I was utterly alone. I had locked the main entrance myself after the last librarian left at 10. Hello? My voice sounded thin and brittle in the cavernous space. No response came, only the persistent drumming of rain against glass. Returning to my work, I tried to focus on the manuscript before me, a 16th century student's thesis, abandoned halfway through. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic toward the final pages, as though written in great distress. According to the library records, its author, Thomas Welling, had disappeared before completing his studies. No explanation was ever discovered. As I traced my finger along his final written words, the temperature around me plummeted. My breath frosted in the air, impossible for May, even in this old building. The reading lamp flickered, its steady glow dimming momentarily before stabilizing again. Just faulty wiring in an ancient building, I assured myself. But the rational explanation did nothing to quell the unease rising within me. I gathered my notes, suddenly eager to leave. As I slid Thomas's unfinished thesis back into its protective sleeve, my fingers brushed against something tucked between the pages, a folded note that hadn't been there when I first opened the manuscript. The paper felt impossibly crisp, as though recently pressed, not centuries old. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. The handwriting matched Thomas's precisely, yet the ink appeared fresh, glistening under the lamplight. They won't let us leave until we finish. The words blurred before my eyes as a wave of dizziness washed over me. When my vision cleared, the note had vanished, leaving no evidence it had ever existed. From the darkest corner of the stacks came the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet, the hesitant gait of someone attempting stealth. I rose slowly, scanning the shadows between bookshelves. The library's closed, I called, struggling to keep my voice steady. If someone's there, please identify yourself. The shuffling stopped, replaced by silence so absolute it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, from all around me, behind shelves, above in the galleries, from inside the walls themselves, came whispers. Dozens of them, overlapping, speaking in languages both familiar and unknown. Some pleaded, others warned, many simply repeated the same phrases with increasing urgency. Help me finish it. They won't let us leave. The deadline approaches. I cannot complete it alone. The lamps throughout the library dimmed in unison, plunging the vast room into near darkness. Only my reading lamp remained lit, creating a small island of light in a sea of shadows. From those shadows emerged not bodies, but impressions of them, translucent silhouettes of hunched figures bent over invisible desks, their hands moving frantically as though writing against impossible deadlines. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat echoing the ticking clock. The rational part of my mind, the scholar, the skeptic, searched desperately for explanations, hallucinations from exhaustion, elaborate pranks, carbon monoxide leaking from ancient heating ducts. But deeper instincts recognize truth when confronted by it. These were the voices of Thornwood's lost students, those who had vanished over the centuries, leaving behind unfinished works and unanswered questions. As this realization crystallized, the whispers converged into a single, unified plea that seemed to emanate from Thomas's manuscript: join us. Help us finish. Stay. The library door, the one I had locked hours earlier, swung shut with a resounding boom. The lock turned with a click that echoed across the silent room. And somewhere in the darkness, someone began to write. The question from Elliot, the head archivist, lingered in my mind as I descended the narrow spiral staircase the following evening. After yesterday's experience, I'd spent the day convincing myself of carbon monoxide poisoning or sleep deprivation, anything to explain away what couldn't possibly have happened. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Who would believe me? Instead, I'd requested access to the sub-basement archives, where the university's oldest and most fragile documents were stored. Elliot had raised an eyebrow at my request. Those records haven't been properly cataloged since 1938, he'd warned. Most faculty don't bother with them anymore. I'm researching academic attrition rates throughout the university's history, I lied. Student disappearances, specifically. His expression had shifted subtly, concern, fear, before he handed me the iron key. Be sure to leave before midnight, he'd said. The environmental controls reset automatically, and you don't want to be locked down there when they do. The staircase wound downward, each step groaning under my weight. The air grew noticeably cooler and damper with my descent. Unlike the grandeur of the main library with its polished oak and brass fixtures, the sub-basement was utilitarian: concrete floors, metal shelving, harsh fluorescent lighting that buzzed and flickered. I reached the bottom and surveyed my surroundings. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the gloom, laden with acid-free boxes, leather portfolios, and rolled parchments. The ceiling hung low, creating a sense of compression that the upper floors, with their vaulted heights, never imposed. Water pipes ran exposed overhead, occasionally dripping condensation onto the floor. The clock on the wall read 8:17. I had less than 4 hours before the supposed system reset. I began systematically combing through the administrative records, searching for patterns in the university's history. Student attendance logs, faculty meeting minutes, disciplinary records. I scanned them all, looking for mentions of disappearances similar to Thomas Welling's. Time slipped away as I immersed myself in the lives of Blackfield University's forgotten students. James Harrington, 1923, last seen entering the library 3 days before his doctoral defense, his dissertation discovered on a reading table with the final chapter incomplete. Eliza Montgomery, 1879, vanished while researching ancient burial rites, her notes ending mid-sentence. William Chen, 1952, reported hearing voices from the stacks before his disappearance. And others, so many others. Not publicized, not investigated beyond perfunctory inquiries, but carefully documented in these bureaucratic records. All disappeared from this library. All left unfinished academic works behind. As I jotted down names and dates, I became aware of a change in the atmosphere. The fluorescent lights had dimmed imperceptibly, casting longer shadows across the floor. The constant hum of the climate control system had quieted, leaving behind an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional drip of condensation. I checked the clock, 11:45. I had been working for hours without realizing it. Time to leave, as Elliot had warned. I gathered my notes and turned toward the stairs, and froze. Standing at the base of the staircase was a young man in outdated clothing, a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, high-waisted trousers, round spectacles perched on a thin nose. He might have stepped out of a 1950s faculty photograph. He stood utterly still, staring not at me but at a point just past my shoulder. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize anyone else was down here. The figure gave no indication of having heard me. His lips moved silently, as though rehearsing an argument or presentation. I took a cautious step toward him. "The archives are closing soon. We should both head upstairs." As I drew closer, I noticed alarming details I'd missed from a distance. His skin had an unnatural pallor, almost translucent under the flickering lights. His eyes, visible now behind those round spectacles, were not focused on anything in this world. They stared, unblinking and clouded with cataracts, into some middle distance. Still, he blocked my only exit. I would need to pass him to reach the stairs. "Sir?" I tried one last time, reaching out instinctively. My hand passed through his shoulder. I recoiled, stumbling backward into a shelving unit that rattled dangerously. The figure remained unmoved, unaffected by my presence. Still, his lips formed words I couldn't hear, growing more agitated with each silent syllable. The lights flickered again, longer this time, momentarily plunging the room into darkness. When they returned, the figure was gone. My heart racing, I rushed to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. I reached the landing and grabbed the handle of the heavy metal door that separated the sub-basement from the main library, only to find it immovable. I pushed harder, then pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The clock on the wall now read 12:01. The environmental controls had reset, just as Elliot had warned. I was locked in. I reached for my phone. No signal. Of course not. I was essentially in a concrete bunker beneath tons of stone and earth. A soft scratching sound drew my attention back to the archives. Someone, or something, was writing. The sound came from deeper in the stacks, a rhythmic scratching of pen against paper. Despite every instinct screaming to stay by the door, I found myself drawn toward the sound. I moved cautiously between the metal shelves, following the noise to its source. In the farthest corner of the archives, beneath the steady drip of a leaking pipe, sat a wooden desk that seemed conspicuously out of place among the utilitarian metal furnishings. Atop it lay an open ledger, its pages yellowed with age. A fountain pen moved across the paper, guided by invisible hands. As I watched, frozen in horrified fascination, my name appeared on the page, written in elegant script below a long list of others. Next to it materialized today's date, and beside that, a single word, candidate. The pen paused, hovering expectantly above the page. From all around me came the sounds of rustling paper and scratching pens, dozens of them, working furiously in the darkness beyond the range of the flickering lights. And beneath those sounds, barely audible, whispers. Join our research. Help us complete the work. So close to understanding. Need more time. The library keeps what belongs to it. The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me as the whispers grew more insistent, more desperate. The pen still hovered above my name, waiting. With sudden clarity, I understood. The library didn't just house unfinished works, it collected unfinished scholars. Those who became so consumed by their research that they lost themselves within it, becoming part of the library's eternal quest for knowledge. And now it had added my name to its collection. The lights went out completely, leaving me in perfect darkness. But in that darkness, I could see them, ghostly figures hunched over ethereal desks, writing endlessly on manuscripts that would never be completed. Among them, William Chen looked up from his work and met my gaze with milky, unseeing eyes. "We have all the time in the world now," he said, his voice distant yet perfectly clear. "But it's never enough to finish." The pen began to move again, adding a final note beside my name. I ran blindly through the darkness, colliding with shelves and sending papers flying, guided only by my desperate need to reach the stairs, the door, any way out of this academic purgatory. Behind me, the whispers rose to a chorus of pleas and warnings. "Stay with us. You'll understand everything if you just keep researching. There's no graduation from this program." I crashed into the staircase and clambered upward, my hands scraping against rough concrete walls. I reached the door and threw my weight against it repeatedly, screaming for help that couldn't possibly hear me through the soundproof barrier. On my third attempt, the door swung open unexpectedly. I tumbled through it, sprawling onto the polished floor of the main library. Standing over me, key in hand and concern etched on his face, was Elliot. "I thought you'd left hours ago," he said, helping me to my feet. "What were you doing down there in the dark?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Instead, I mumbled something about falling asleep while researching. Elliot studied my face, then glanced toward the open doorway to the sub-basement. For a moment, I thought he might reveal he knew exactly what lurked below. Instead, he simply said, "That place can be disorienting. Best not to go down alone again." As he locked the door behind us, I caught a glimpse of the sub-basement beyond. In the sliver of light from the main library, I saw the ghostly researcher sitting at his desk, pen poised above the ledger. He looked up, meeting my gaze directly this time, and smiled, a gesture not of malice but of welcome, as though certain of my eventual return. The door closed with finality, but I knew the boundary it represented was far more permeable than iron and wood would suggest. The library had marked me as its own, and sooner or later it would collect what belonged to it. Professor Harlow's casual remark during our weekly advising session struck me like a physical blow. 3 days had passed since my experience in the sub-basement, and I'd avoided the library entirely, working from my cramped apartment instead. I'd told no one what happened, who would believe me? But the avoidance was taking its toll on my research progress. "Are you all right?" Harlow asked, peering at me over his wire-rimmed glasses. "You seem distracted lately." I forced a smile. "Just tired. I've been having trouble sleeping." This much was true. Each night since the incident, I'd woken at precisely 3:17 in the morning, my room filled with the sound of turning pages though no books were open. Each time, I'd find new annotations in my research journals, notes written in handwriting not my own, offering insights into texts I hadn't yet examined. "Perhaps you should take a break from your research," Arlo suggested, closing the folder containing my pitiful progress report. Academic burnout is common among doctoral candidates. I'm fine, I insisted. I just need to get back to the primary sources. Arlo's expression shifted subtly. The Thornwood materials? I wouldn't recommend working with those directly. The library has digital scans of most of them. Digital scans don't capture the marginalia properly, I explained, recalling the critical details often lost in digitization, the pressure of the pen, the quality of the ink, the emotional state revealed in the handwriting. I need to see the originals. He studied me for a long moment before responding. Just be careful. Some texts in that collection have unusual properties. What do you mean? Nothing concrete, he said, waiting dismissively. Just old academic superstitions. But still, I'd advise against spending too many late nights alone in those archives. As I left his office, a question nagged at me. How had Harlow known I was working late nights in the library? I hadn't mentioned it to him. Despite my misgivings, I returned to Thornwood Library that evening. The familiar scent of aged paper and leather bindings greeted me as I pushed through the heavy oak doors. The main reading room was busy with undergraduates preparing for finals, their presence reassuring after my solitary experiences. I approached the special collections desk where Elliot sat cataloging new acquisitions. Back again? He asked, not looking up from his work. I thought you might have abandoned your research after the other night. Just a misunderstanding, I said lightly. I must have fallen asleep down there. Elliot finally raised his eyes to mine. People often lose track of time in libraries. Especially this one. There was something knowing in his gaze that made me uncomfortable. I changed the subject. I need access to the medieval marginalia collection, please. The Thomas Welling manuscript specifically. Elliot's hand paused over his keyboard. That particular item has been temporarily removed from circulation. Why? Conservation concerns, he said smoothly. The binding showed signs of deterioration. I was certain the manuscript had been in excellent condition when I handled it last. Then I'll need to see the records of anyone who completed work similar to Welling's. His contemporaries, perhaps. Elliot hesitated before nodding. I'll bring what we have to your usual table. Give me 15 minutes. I settled at my preferred spot near the stained glass windows. The late afternoon sun filtered through the colored panes, casting prismatic patterns across the polished wood. Around me, students typed on laptops or flipped through textbooks, their mundane activities a comforting reminder of the normal academic world. When Elliot returned, he carried an acid-free box containing several folders. These are contemporaries of Welling, he explained. Students who were working on similar linguistic analysis during the same period. I thanked him and began examining the materials. Most were unremarkable, competent but uninspired academic exercises typical of 16th century scholarship. But the third folder contained something different, a thin volume whose cover bore the name Margaret Ainslie, 1583. Margaret's thesis examined the same obscure dialectical variations that had fascinated Thomas Welling. And like Thomas, her work remained unfinished. The final page ended mid-sentence, the pen stroke trailing off as though the writer had been interrupted or pulled away. What caught my attention, however, were the margins. Unlike the clean borders of most academic works, Margaret's thesis was crowded with annotations, some in her own hand, others in different scripts entirely. Some appeared to be responses to her arguments, others seemed to be communications directed at Margaret herself. One note, written in tiny, precise lettering along the bottom margin of page 27 chilled me. They speak through the margins. The spaces between academic thoughts are where their voices emerge. Be careful what you write. They're always reading over your shoulder. As I read these words, the ambient noise of the library, the typing, page turning, whispered conversations faded away. The air around me grew still and heavy, as though the atmospheric pressure had suddenly increased. From the corner of my eye, I could see the other students frozen in place like figures in a paused video. I looked down at Margaret's thesis again and gasped. New writing was appearing in the margin beside my thumb, elegant script forming words in real time. You're beginning to understand. We exist in the spaces between scholarship, neither fully present in your world nor entirely absent from it. The library is our liminal space, our purgatory. My hand trembled as I watched more words materialize. Thornwood doesn't just collect books. It collects the unfinished thoughts of those who studied here. We are the marginalia of the university, noted but unincorporated, acknowledged but unresolved. I dropped the book as though it had burned me. The writing stopped immediately, the ink drying instantly on the page. Around me, the library's normal activity resumed as though nothing had happened, students continuing their studies, oblivious to the momentary suspension of reality. I forced myself to pick up Margaret's thesis again, turning to the final page. There, in the administrative notes, I found what I had begun to suspect. Student disappeared prior to completion. Personal effects found abandoned in Thornwood Library, April 21st, 1583. With growing dread, I examined the remaining files. Each told a similar story, promising scholars whose work remained unfinished, whose disappearances were noted with bureaucratic indifference in the university records. All had vanished from this library. All had been studying aspects of communication, language, symbols, translation. And in every manuscript, the margins teemed with annotations added long after the original authors had vanished. I became aware of someone standing beside my table. Looking up, I expected to see Elliot, but instead found myself facing a young woman in Tudor-era clothing, her pale face framed by a simple linen cap. Though transparent, I could see the bookshelves through her form. She appeared more substantial than the apparitions I'd encountered before. "Margaret Ainsley," she said, her voice carrying the faint echo of someone speaking from within a well. "You've been reading my work." Around us, the modern students continued their studies, utterly unaware of her presence. "They can't see me," she explained, noting my confusion. "Only those who have been marked by the library can perceive us." "Marked?" I whispered. She gestured toward my research journal, which lay open beside Margaret's thesis. To my horror, I saw annotations appearing in its margins, notes in various handwritings, comments on my methodology, suggestions for sources I hadn't yet discovered. "We've been assisting your research," Margaret said, "as we do for all promising scholars who might help us complete our work." "What work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Margaret's expression grew solemn. "The Great Compilation. The ultimate academic endeavor that Thornwood has been gathering for centuries." She gestured toward the shadowy upper galleries. "It collects us where our mortal bodies can no longer sustain the pursuit of knowledge. It gives us eternity to continue our research." "That sounds like imprisonment," I said. "It began that way," she acknowledged. "But over time, we came to understand the gift we've been given. Unlimited access to all knowledge, past and present. The ability to communicate across centuries with like-minded scholars." Her transparent hand hovered over my research notes. "The chance to complete what we started." From the corners and shadows of the reading room, I now perceived other figures emerging, ghostly researchers from various historical periods, all watching our exchange with solemn interest. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "To join us," Margaret said simply. "Your work on marginalia, on the voices that exist in the spaces between official discourse, it's crucial to the compilation. With your contribution, we might finally complete enough to move beyond this place." "And if I refuse?" The ghost's expression hardened. "No one refuses Thornwood once they've been marked. You can leave the building, but your mind will remain connected to us. Your research will draw you back. Your unfinished work will haunt you until you return to complete it." As if to demonstrate, she reached toward my open journal. Where her translucent finger touched the page, new text appeared, insights into my research that I had not yet formulated but recognized immediately as logical extensions of my work. "You see," she said, "we're already collaborating, already intertwined. Your academic soul belongs to Thornwood now, just as ours do." The library bell tolled, signaling closing time. The students around me began packing their belongings, shutting laptops, returning books to reshelving carts. The ghostly figures retreated to the shadows, fading from view, all except Margaret, who remained beside my table. "They'll lock the doors soon," she said. "You should leave, for now. But remember, true scholarship is never finished, merely abandoned. And Thornwood doesn't permit abandonment." As I gathered my materials with shaking hands, she added, "We'll continue our discussion in the margins." She disappeared as the fluorescent lights flickered on, replacing the fading natural light. I hurried toward the exit, desperate to escape the building before night fully descended. But as I passed through the security gates, I felt something intangible stretch between me and the library, an intellectual umbilical cord that both sustained and bound me. Outside, the cool evening air cleared my head somewhat. I walked briskly across the campus quad, putting physical distance between myself and Thornwood. But Margaret's words echoed in my mind, "No one refuses Thornwood once they've been marked." That night, I dreamed of endless rows of books with my name on their spines, volumes I had not yet written but somehow already existed in the library's collection. I woke at 3:17 precisely to find my research journal open on my desk, its margins filled with new annotations. Beside it lay a note written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of composing it. "The library awaits your return. Your desk has been prepared. Your contribution to the compilation begins tomorrow. When was the last time you slept properly?" Professor Harlow's question caught me off guard. 2 weeks had passed since my encounter with Margaret Ainsley's ghost, 2 weeks of avoiding Thornwood Library during daylight hours only to find myself inexplicably standing before its Gothic facade each night as the clock struck midnight. I hadn't entered, not yet, but each morning I'd wake to find my research advancing without my conscious participation. My journal filled with insights written in my hand but not by my waking mind. My laptop contained files I had no memory of creating, all advancing my dissertation on marginalia and the voices that exist in academic liminal spaces. "I'm fine," I lied, avoiding Harlow's concerned gaze. The dark circles under my eyes told a different story. "You don't look fine," he countered, leaning forward across his desk. "And your latest draft, it's concerning." "Concerning how?" I asked defensively. "The research is solid. The sources are—" "Impossible," Harlow interrupted. "You've cited primary sources that don't exist in any known collection. You've quoted from works that were never completed." He tapped my draft. This passage allegedly from Margaret Ainsley's thesis conclusion, her work famously has no conclusion. She disappeared before writing it. My mouth went dry. I must have made a mistake in my citations. This isn't just a citation error, Harlow insisted. This is fabrication of evidence. Academic misconduct of the highest order. Or, he hesitated. Or what? Harlow removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Or something far stranger is happening. He looked at me directly. They're helping you write it, aren't they? The voices in the margins. My heart seemed to stop. How do you know about them? He smiled grimly. I've been at this university for 30 years. I've seen what happens to promising scholars who spend too much time in Thornwood's archives. He rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a forearm covered in minute writing, text that appeared to be inscribed directly into his skin like an elaborate tattoo. They marked me too, once. I stared at the tiny script that wrapped around his arm. What is that? Annotations, he explained. Their commentary on my research. Their suggestions. Their demands. He rolled his sleeve down again. It began just as you're experiencing, notes in my journals, files I didn't remember creating. Then it progressed to this. He gestured to his arm. Their influence becomes more permanent the longer you resist them. How did you escape? I asked desperately. Who says I escaped? Harlow's laugh held no humor. I merely negotiated terms. I provide them with new research materials, books, articles, dissertations. Fresh academic blood. In exchange, they allow me to maintain the illusion of independence. Horror washed over me as understanding dawned. You've been feeding them your students. Not feeding, he corrected sharply. Introducing. The library only takes those who are receptive, those whose intellectual curiosity outweighs their self-preservation. Those who, deep down, would choose eternal research over mortal limitations. Like me, I whispered. Harlow nodded. You were an ideal candidate. Your fascination with marginalia, with the voices that exist in the spaces between official discourse, it resonated with them immediately. What is it they're working on? I asked. Margaret mentioned something called the compilation. The Great Compilation, Harlow confirmed. The ultimate academic work, a comprehensive synthesis of all human knowledge structured through a perfect linguistic framework that transcends the limitations of individual languages. That's impossible, I said. Of course it is, Harlow agreed. That's why it's eternal. That's why the library needs to keep collecting brilliant minds to continue the work. He leaned forward again. But here's what you need to understand. They believe they're close to a breakthrough. Your research on marginalia, on the communication that happens in the borders and footnotes of academic discourse, they see it as the missing piece. I won't help them, I declared. You already are, Harlow said gently. Those files you don't remember creating? That work is being incorporated into the compilation even now. The only choice remaining is whether you'll join them consciously or be drawn in piece by piece, your intellectual contribution separated from your awareness of making it. I stood abruptly, gathering my papers. I'm leaving. I'm getting as far from that library as possible. It won't work, Harlow called as I reached the door. The connection is already established. The further you try to run, the more violently you'll be pulled back. His voice softened. At least this way, Your contribution will be recognized. Your name will be included in the compilation's authorship. I slammed the door behind me, hurrying across campus with no clear destination. My mind raced with escape plans, leave the university, abandon my dissertation, flee to another country. But even as these thoughts formed, I felt the tug of intellectual obligation, the scholar's compulsion to complete what I had begun. Without consciously deciding to do so, I found my feet carrying me toward Thornwood Library. I stopped at the base of its stone steps, looking up at the imposing structure with new understanding. It wasn't just a building that contained books, it was an entity that collected minds, an academic parasite that fed on intellectual obsession. Inside, I knew the ghosts of scholars past were waiting for me. Margaret Ainsley, Thomas Welling, William Chen, and countless others whose names appeared only in the dusty administrative records of disappeared students, all working eternally on a project designed never to be completed. I turned away, determined to resist, but as I did, pain lanced through my head, a migraine so intense it dropped me to my knees. Through watering eyes, I saw text appearing on the backs of my hands, tiny, precise annotations in an archaic script. Gasping, I stumbled up the library steps and through the doors, the pain receding as soon as I crossed the threshold. The main reading room was empty, the library closed for the evening, yet all the lights blazed as though in anticipation of my arrival. Elliot stood behind the circulation desk, his expression unsurprised. "They're waiting for you in the manuscript room," he said simply. "You're one of them," I realized. Elliot smiled thinly. "I maintain the physical collection, just as they maintain the intellectual one." He gestured toward a door marked "Staff Only." "Go on. It's time you saw what you're contributing to." My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me through the door and down a corridor I had never noticed before. The hallway stretched impossibly long, lined with portraits of scholars whose eyes seemed to follow my progress. At its end stood an unmarked wooden door that swung open at my approach. Beyond lay a vast circular chamber that could not possibly fit within Thornwood's architectural footprint. The room stretched upward for several stories, its walls lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of countless manuscripts. At its center stood a massive round table surrounded by chairs from various historical periods, many occupied by the translucent forms of scholars I now recognized from university portraits and photographs. And spread across the table was the compilation, not a single document but thousands of pages, scrolls, tablets, and digital displays arranged in a complex pattern that somehow suggested interconnection despite the disparate formats. Some pages contained text so ancient the languages had been dead for millennia, others displayed digital code that seemed to shift and evolve as I watched. Margaret Ainsley rose from her chair, her ghostly form more substantial here than when I'd seen her in the reading room. "Welcome to the heart of Thornwood," she said. "This is where the compilation grows." I approached the table cautiously. "What exactly am I looking at?" "The sum of human academic endeavor," replied an elderly man in Victorian academic robes. "Every discipline, every field of study, every approach to knowledge, all synthesized into a unified whole." "Impossible," I murmured. "With conventional methods, yes," agreed a woman in 1960s attire. "That's why we need unconventional researchers. Those who can see connections across disciplines, across time periods, across the very boundaries of human understanding." "Like you," Margaret added. "Your work on marginalia, on the voices that exist in the spaces between official discourse, it provides a framework for understanding how disparate knowledge systems can communicate with each other." I circled the table slowly, examining the fragments of the compilation. Despite my fear, my academic curiosity was undeniably piqued. The scope of the project was breathtaking, the ambition behind it awe-inspiring. How long has this been going on? I asked. Since Stormwood was built, answered a monk in medieval garb, though the compilation has taken different forms through the centuries. What began as theological synthesis expanded with each new field of human inquiry. And you're all trapped here? I asked. Forced to work on this forever? The scholars exchanged glances. Not trapped, Thomas Welling said, speaking for the first time. Liberated. Freed from the limitations of mortal lifespans, able to pursue knowledge without the constraints of time. That's not how it seemed when you first contacted me, I pointed out. Your message said they won't let us leave until we finish. A momentary frustration, Thomas admitted. The work can be demanding, but the rewards. He gestured to the vast library surrounding us. Unlimited access to all human knowledge. The chance to collaborate with the greatest minds from every era. And eternal life, added William Chen. Of a sort. I noted their unanimous enthusiasm with suspicion. If it's so wonderful, why the need to learn new scholars? Why not simply invite them openly? Few would believe, Margaret replied. Fewer still would choose this existence willingly, at first. But once they understand the nature of the work, they become willing participants, finished the Victorian gentleman. As we all did. As you will. I haven't agreed to anything, I protested. But you will, Elliot's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, more solid than the ghostly scholars yet somehow less substantial than what I had seen in minutes before. The choice is already made. It was made the moment you became more interested in the voices in the margins than in your own voice. My head throbbed as academic excitement warred with primal fear. Part of me, the scholar, the researcher, was already cataloging the incredible opportunity before me. Unlimited time to pursue my studies. Access to sources lost to history. Collaboration with brilliant minds across centuries. Another part, the human, the mortal, recoiled from the unnatural extension of consciousness, the endless labor toward an impossible goal, the severance from the normal progression of life. I need time to think, I said, backing toward the door. Of course, Margaret agreed, too readily. Return to your apartment. Consider our offer. But know that your contribution has already begun. She gestured to a section of the table where pages in my handwriting had been incorporated into the compilation, work I had no memory of producing. I fled the manuscript room, hurrying through the twisted corridor that now seemed to contract rather than expand, depositing me back in the main library within seconds. I burst through the front doors into the night air, gulping it greedily as though I'd been underwater. Campus was deserted at this hour. I ran toward my apartment building, desperate to put distance between myself and Thornwood. But with each step, the pain in my head intensified. By the time I reached my building, black spots danced before my eyes, and the skin of my hands crawled with the sensation of invisible writing appearing on their surface. I stumbled into my apartment and collapsed on the bed, consciousness fading. My last thought before darkness claimed me was that I had never actually seen any of the ghostly scholars leave the library grounds. Perhaps they couldn't. Perhaps the physical boundary still existed, even if the intellectual one did not. When I awoke, sunlight streamed through my windows. My migraine had receded, leaving only a dull pressure behind my eyes. I reached for my phone to check the time and froze. My arms were covered in tiny writing, annotations that spiraled from wrist to shoulder, disappearing beneath my shirt sleeves. I rushed to the bathroom mirror and discovered with horror that the text continued across my chest, my back, my face. Every inch of exposed skin now served as parchment for the compilation's marginalia. The writing shifted as I watched, new annotations appearing as others faded, as though my body had become a palimpsest for the collective research of Thornwood scholars. And with growing dread, I realized I could understand all of it: equations from advanced physics, passages in languages I'd never studied, technical terminology from disciplines beyond my expertise. The compilation was inscribing itself on me, making me its newest page. My phone rang, startling me from my horrified fascination. Professor Harlow's name flashed on the screen. "What's happening to me?" I demanded as soon as I answered. "The integration has begun," Harlow replied calmly. "Faster than usual. They must be very interested in your contribution. Make it stop." "I can't," he said. "No one can, not completely. But you can still negotiate terms, as I did." He paused. "Come to my office. We'll discuss options." I hung up and returned to the mirror. The writing had settled somewhat, no longer actively shifting before my eyes. I pulled on a turtleneck sweater and gloves despite the warm spring day, covering as much of the text as possible. As I prepared to leave, my gaze fell on my laptop. A new document was open on the screen, one I had no memory of creating. Its title read, "Terms of Academic Integration, a Proposal to the Thornwood Compilation." It was a contract of sorts, written in my own academic style, but proposing conditions I had never consciously considered: specified hours of contribution to the compilation, limited physical manifestation of the annotations, freedom to pursue independent research alongside required collaborative work. At the bottom was a signature line, awaiting my name. I slammed the laptop shut and hurried out the door. Harlow would know what to do. He had managed to establish boundaries with the library. Perhaps he could help me do the same. But as I crossed campus, I realized I was headed not toward Harlow's office, but toward Thornwood Library. My feet seemed to know their own destination, regardless of my conscious intentions. Each attempt to change direction resulted in stabbing pain behind my eyes and increasing illegibility of the writing on my skin, as though the compilation itself was expressing its displeasure. I stopped in the middle of the quad, fighting for control of my own body. Students passed by, giving me strange looks as I stood frozen in apparent internal conflict. "They already own part of you," came a voice beside me. I turned to find Elliot walking alongside me, though I hadn't noticed his approach. "The only question now is how much of yourself you wish to retain." "I didn't agree to any of this," I hissed. "Didn't you?" Elliot gestured to my research journals, which I'd unconsciously brought with me. "Every time you pursued the voices in the margins instead of the main text. Every time you chose research over human connection. Every time you sacrificed sleep, meals, relationships for academic pursuit." He smiled sadly. "The compilation doesn't take unwilling participants. It merely recognizes those who have already chosen knowledge over life." As we reached the library steps, I saw Professor Harlow waiting at the entrance. Beside him stood the translucent forms of Margaret Ainsley, Thomas Welling, and other scholars from the manuscript room, visible now even in broad daylight, at least to my altered perception. "You have a choice to make," Harlow said as I approached. "Not whether to join the compilation, the decision was made long ago. But how you join. Under what terms? What are my options?" I asked, resignation creeping into my voice. "Total integration," Margaret answered. "Your consciousness fully merged with the compilation, your physical form abandoned. You would exist as we do, as pure academic thought, unconstrained by bodily needs or mortal limitations. Or partial integration, Harlow added, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the annotations on his arm. You maintain your physical existence, your separate identity. You contribute to the compilation but retain your own research agenda. In exchange, you help identify and recruit new candidates as needed. Like you do with me, I said bitterly. Harlow nodded without apology. The compilation must grow. New perspectives, new methodologies, new connections between fields of knowledge, all are necessary for progress. And if I refuse both options? The integration continues regardless, Elliot said. But chaotically, painfully, without structure or boundaries. Your mind fragmented between your mortal existence and your academic contribution. Eventually, madness. I looked at the spectral scholars arrayed before me, at Harlow with his annotated arm, at Elliot who seemed to flicker between corporeal and incorporeal existence. All had made their choices, for good or ill. And now it was my turn. The writing on my skin crawled in anticipation. The question hung in the air between us as I sat across from Professor Harlow in his office. 3 days had passed since my confrontation at the library steps. 3 days of negotiation, of careful wording, of searching for loopholes in the academic pact I was being forced to make. The annotations on my skin had stabilized somewhat, no longer actively crawling across my body but shifting subtly when new information related to my research emerged in the world. I had taken to wearing long sleeves and high collars despite the warming spring weather. Not sentient like human consciousness, Harlow continued without waiting for my answer. But aware in its own way. Seeking connection, completion, comprehension. He leaned back in his chair. The compilation isn't just a project created by scholars. In some ways, the scholars are projects created by the compilation. That's not comforting, I replied. It's not meant to be. Harlow pushed a folder across his desk. These are the terms I've negotiated on your behalf. The best I could do, given your level of integration already. I opened the folder to find a document written in archaic legal language, with margins filled with annotations in various hands, clarifications, amendments, commentaries on the main text. My eyes struggled to focus on the central document with so many voices competing from the periphery. Essentially, Harlow explained, you maintain your physical existence. You'll continue your doctoral program and eventually join the faculty. You'll have limited access to the manuscript room and the collected knowledge of the compilation. In exchange, you'll contribute your research on marginalia and help identify promising candidates for future integration. You're asking me to become a recruiter, I said flatly. To do to others what you did to me. I'm offering you the chance to maintain some semblance of normal life, Harlow countered. The alternative is full integration. Abandoning your physical form to become one with the formwood consciousness. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. And if I sign neither agreement? Then the integration continues unstructured and uncontrolled, he said, not unkindly. Your consciousness gradually absorbed into the compilation while your body remains an empty shell going through the motions of academic life without true awareness. He tapped the folder. At least this way, you maintain agency. You decide when and how much you contribute. I stared at the contract, the academic language both familiar and alienating. This was not how I had imagined my scholarly career would progress when I began my doctorate. I had envisioned conferences, publications, perhaps tenure at a respectable university. Not supernatural pacts with library-bound entities. I need more time, I said finally. Time is precisely what's at issue here, Harlow replied. The longer you delay, the further the integration progresses on its own terms rather than yours. He checked his watch. You have until midnight. After that, your options become more limited. I left his office and wandered campus aimlessly, the contract tucked into my bag like a ticking bomb. Students lounged on the quad enjoying the spring sunshine, their academic concerns limited to grades and deadlines, not metaphysical bargains with knowledge entities. How simple their scholarly pursuits seemed, bounded by semesters, by graduation requirements, by the ordinary progression from ignorance to understanding. My own research had led me beyond those boundaries into a realm where knowledge was not just acquired but acquisitive, not just pursued but pursuing. Without conscious decision, I found myself at the Blackfield University archives, not the haunted stacks of Thornwood but the modern administrative building where the university's official records were kept. I had an idea, a desperate one, but perhaps the only leverage I might find. The records clerk, a cheerful woman named Patricia, greeted me warmly. Back again? More research on historical attrition rates? I nodded, having forgotten the pretext under which I'd first accessed these records. I'm tracking patterns in student disappearances, particularly those associated with unfinished academic work. Morbid topic, Patricia commented, but we've got plenty of material. This university has been losing promising scholars since its founding. She led me to a research terminal. Electronic records go back to 1978. Before that, you need the microfilm or physical ledgers. I spent hours combing through records, searching for something, anything, that might give me leverage against the compilation. What I found instead was a pattern more disturbing than I'd imagined. Every 11 years, like clockwork, the rate of unexplained student disappearances spiked dramatically. Not just random vanishings, but specifically scholars on the verge of completing significant work, doctoral candidates, primarily, but occasionally master's students or even undergraduates engaged in exceptional independent research. And every 11 years, Thornwood Library underwent renovations, expansions, restorations, technological upgrades. As though the building itself were growing in concert with its intellectual collection. The most recent spike had occurred 10 years ago. We were due for another harvest. As this realization settled over me, I became aware of someone standing beside my terminal. Looking up, I expected to see Patricia, but instead found myself facing a young man in contemporary clothing, jeans, hoodie, backpack, yet with the same translucent quality as the ghostly scholars in the manuscript room. William Chen, I whispered, recognizing him from the sub-basement encounter. He nodded. You're looking in the wrong place for leverage, he said, his voice carrying that same echo chamber quality I noted in Margaret's speech. You won't find escape in administrative records. Then where? I demanded. There must be some way to break the connection. William glanced around the archives, then leaned closer. There is no escape, he said. But there is adaptation. Evolution. His form flickered slightly. The compilation changes those who join it. But those who join also change the compilation. What do you mean? Your research on marginalia, on the voices that exist in academic interstitial spaces, it's already altering how the compilation functions. How we communicate within it. He tapped my arm where the annotations sprawled beneath my sleeve. These aren't just comments on your work. They're changes to the fundamental architecture of our collective consciousness. I stared at him, not comprehending. The compilation has existed for centuries, William continued, collecting scholars, accumulating knowledge. but it has never had anyone who specifically studied its method of communication, the marginalia, the annotations, the voices between official discourse. Your work provides a framework for understanding the compilation itself. And that matters because you can't destroy the compilation, Williams said urgently. But you might be able to transform it. To shift it from a parasite to a symbiotic entity. He glanced toward the door. They're coming. They know I'm talking to you. Just remember, signing the contract doesn't end your agency. It begins a new phase of it. He vanished as Patricia rounded the corner, pushing a cart of file boxes. Finding what you need? She asked cheerfully. I nodded absently, my mind racing with the implications of Williams' message. Was he offering genuine insight or simply another lure to draw me deeper into the compilation's grasp? I gathered my notes and left the administrative archives, the weight of the unsigned contract still heavy in my bag. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across campus. I had only hours left before Harlow's deadline. As darkness fell, I found myself once again drawn to Thornwood Library. Its Gothic facade was illuminated from within, windows glowing like eyes in the night. Though the library was officially closed, the main doors swung open at my approach. Elliot waited in the lobby, his form now unmistakably similar to the ghostly scholar's, semi-transparent, with that same quality of existing partially in another dimension. You've come to make your choice, he said. It wasn't a question. I've come to propose an alternative, I replied. Elliot raised an eyebrow. That's not how this works. The terms are set. Terms can be renegotiated. I removed the contract from my bag, along with my own research notes. I've been studying how the compilation communicates through marginalia, through annotations, through the voices that exist in academic interstitial spaces. And I've identified a fundamental flaw in its architecture. This was a bluff, but one based on Williams' cryptic message and my genuine expertise. If the compilation valued my research as much as they claimed, they would at least listen. Elliot's expression remained impassive, but he gestured for me to proceed. The compilation has been accumulating knowledge for centuries, I continued, gaining confidence. But it hasn't been evolving structurally. It's still using the same methods of internal communication that it developed in the medieval period, marginalia, annotations, palimpsestic layering. These methods are inefficient, creating friction between different knowledge domains. I pointed to the annotations on my arm, which had begun to shift and crawl again as I spoke. Look at how chaotic this is, multiple voices competing for the same space, overwhelming the primary text. The compilation is drowning in its own commentary. Elliot studied me for a long moment. What do you propose? A restructuring, I said firmly. Not of the content, but of the framework. A new architecture for how knowledge is organized and communicated within the compilation. One that doesn't require unwilling recruitment or physical manifestation of annotations. The manuscript room, Elliot said abruptly, turning toward the staff door. They need to hear this directly. He led me through the now familiar corridor to the circular chamber where the compilation existed in its physical form. The ghostly scholars were all present, arranged around the massive table with its sprawling collection of documents. Professor Harlow sat among them, looking surprisingly at home in this supernatural academic gathering. Our newest candidate has a proposal, Elliot announced. All eyes turned to me, some curious, others suspicious, a few openly hostile. I swallowed hard, then launched into an expanded version of what I'd told Elliot. I spoke of new frameworks for knowledge organization, of modernizing the compilation's internal communication structures, of creating cleaner boundaries between contributors while maintaining collaborative potential. As I spoke, I noticed the annotations on my skin responding, reorganizing themselves from chaotic sprawl into more orderly arrangements, forming patterns that reflected the structural changes I was proposing. What you're suggesting would fundamentally alter what the compilation is, Margaret Ainsley said when I finished. Its nature has remained consistent for centuries. To its detriment, I countered. Knowledge itself has evolved. The ways humans create, consume, and connect information have transformed dramatically. Yet the compilation still operates on principles established before the printing press, let alone digital communication. There is wisdom in tradition, intoned an elderly monk. And stagnation, I replied. The compilation claims to seek completion, yet its very structure ensures it can never be completed, only endlessly expanded through the addition of new minds. A murmur ran through the assembled scholars. I pressed my advantage. I propose a new contract, I said, pulling out a document I had prepared. One that allows me to retain my physical existence and independent research while contributing to a restructuring of the compilation. In exchange, I won't just help identify new candidates, I'll help create a system where willing scholars can contribute without being consumed. Thomas Welling leaned forward, his ghostly form flickering with excitement. A symbiotic relationship rather than a parasitic one. Exactly, I agreed, meeting his gaze. The compilation gains continued access to new knowledge. Scholars gain access to the collective wisdom without losing themselves to it. Both evolve together. The scholars exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Professor Harlow studied me with newfound respect, or perhaps concerned that his own arrangement might be rendered obsolete. Finally, Margaret spoke again. Your proposal has merit, but there must be assurance of your commitment, a demonstration of your understanding. I've already begun, I said, gesturing to the annotations on my skin, which have reorganized themselves into elegant, non-competing layers. My research is already affecting how the compilation manifests. Imagine what could be accomplished with deliberate restructuring rather than incidental influence. The clock on the wall chimed, marking the approach of midnight. We must decide, Eliot said. The cycle reaches its completion tonight. I held my breath as the spectral scholars conferred among themselves, their whispered discussion creating a sound like pages turning in a distant room. We accept your proposal, Margaret announced finally. With amendments. She gestured to my contract, which now bore marginalia in various hands, but organized neatly in designated spaces rather than chaotically overwhelming the text. I reviewed their additions carefully. They required regular contributions to the compilation, physical presence in the manuscript room during specific astronomical alignments, and oversight of the transition to the new architecture I was proposing. But they also granted me continued corporeal existence, limited manifestation of annotations, and the right to pursue independent research. Most importantly, they agreed to a moratorium on unwilling recruitment. Future scholars would be invited to contribute without physical or psychic coercion. If I sign this, I asked, what happens to the current harvest cycle? It ends with you, Thomas Welling said. You will be the last unwilling integration. Future contributors will enter under the terms you establish. I looked around at the gathering of scholars, brilliant minds trapped in an eternity of endless research, gradually becoming more bibliography than biography. They had all made their choices, or had their choices made for them. Now I was being offered something they never had, the chance to change the terms of engagement. The clock began to strike midnight. With steady hand, I signed my name. The effect was immediate and startling. The annotations on my skin ceased their crawling movement, settling into an organized pattern that spiraled around my arms like academic tattoos. The overwhelming mental pressure I'd felt since entering Thornwood's orbit receded, replaced by a sense of connection that felt more collaborative than coercive. The manuscript room itself seemed to shift, its dimensions altering subtly as the documents on the table reorganized themselves according to the principles I had outlined. The ghostly scholars watched in amazement as centuries of accumulated knowledge began to restructure before their eyes. "It's working," William Chin whispered, appearing beside me. "You're changing it from within." "This is only the beginning," I replied. "True transformation will take time." "Time," Margaret said with a ghostly smile, "is the one resource we have in abundance." As the final stroke of midnight faded, I felt a profound shift in my relationship to the compilation. I was still connected to it, still part of its vast academic network, but no longer being consumed by it. The boundary between my consciousness and the collective had stabilized, permeable but distinct. I looked to Professor Harlow, whose annotated arm had also reorganized into a more structured pattern. "Will you help with the transition?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I've been part of this system for 30 years. Perhaps it's time for it to become something new." The ghostly scholars dispersed, returning to their research with renewed purpose, not just accumulating knowledge but reorganizing it according to the framework I had proposed. Some looked relieved, others uncertain, but all seemed energized by the prospect of evolution rather than mere expansion. I left Thornwood as dawn broke, walking across campus with lighter steps than I had in months. The library still loomed behind me, ancient and imposing, but no longer predatory. We had reached an accord, the compilation and I, not an ending but a transformation. That night, for the first time since encountering Thomas Welling's manuscript, I slept without dreaming of endless research or unfinished work. The annotations on my skin glowed faintly in the darkness of my bedroom, no longer warnings but reminders of the pact I had made to change the relationship between scholars and the knowledge they pursued. In the morning, I found a single note on my desk, written in my own hand though I had no memory of writing it. "The most profound discovery is not what we know but how we know it. The structure of knowledge shapes the knowledge itself. The voices in the margins are no longer content to remain marginal." Welcome to the new compilation. Below it, in a dozen different hands spanning centuries of academic tradition, was written a single word: agreed. "Who's there?" My voice echoed through the empty precinct, bouncing off filing cabinets and desks before dissolving into the silence of 3 in the morning. I'd been staring at the same case file for hours, the words blurring together as fatigue crept in. The disappearance of Emily Wright, age 28, had consumed my every waking moment for the past 2 weeks. I'm Detective Michael Harmon, 15 years on the force in the quiet town of Pinewood, a place where everyone knew everyone, where serious crimes were rare enough that each one left a scar on our collective memory. I had circles under my eyes deep enough to plant seeds in, and my coffee had gone cold hours ago. The precinct lights hummed overhead, that familiar fluorescent buzz that became white noise after enough years. Something felt different tonight. The ancient heating system always made strange noises, but tonight the building seemed to breathe. I glanced at the empty desk across from mine. Detective James Collins had occupied that space for 10 years before the accident 3 months ago. The department hadn't reassigned his desk yet. Some unspoken agreement kept it intact, his coffee mug still there, pens arranged in perfect order. James had always been meticulous. A sudden draft rippled the papers on my desk. I looked up at the air vent. It wasn't running. Just tired, I muttered, rubbing my eyes. But the prickling sensation on the back of my neck wouldn't subside. It felt like someone was watching me from the darkened hallway that led to the evidence room. The fluorescent light above James's desk flickered once, twice, then steadied. Old wiring, I told myself. The building dated back to the 1950s, and budget cuts meant maintenance requests gathered dust. I turned back to Emily Wright's file. 28, kindergarten teacher, vanished on her way home from a friend's house. Her car found abandoned at Miller's Creek, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. James would have figured it out by now. He had an instinct for these cases, a way of seeing connections I missed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly. I could see my breath forming a small cloud in front of my face. My rational mind said faulty thermostat, but something deeper, more primitive, whispered other possibilities. I pulled my jacket tighter and reached for my phone. The screen showed 3:15 a.m. and no signal. That was odd. We always had service in the building. The light above James's desk flickered again, more urgently this time, a rapid staccato that sent shadows dancing across the room. Then it went out completely, leaving his desk in darkness while the rest of the precinct remained lit. Maintenance is going to hear about this, I grumbled, but my voice sounded thin and uncertain. I heard it then, the soft squeak of James's chair. The empty chair. Rotating slowly, a half turn, as if someone had just sat down. My heart hammered against my ribs. The room felt glacial now, my fingers stiff with cold as I slowly stood up. "Hello?" I called, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, but it was a loaded silence, pregnant with anticipation. The dark outline of James's desk seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat rising from asphalt in summer. A pen rolled across the surface of his desk, coming to rest against the keyboard. I reached for my service weapon, the movement automatic after years of training. "This is Detective Harmon. Identify yourself." The drawer of James's desk slid open, just an inch, then two. The sound of wood scraping against wood impossibly loud in the silent precinct. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my body torn between flight and investigation. This was my precinct, my territory. I took a step toward the desk, gun aimed at the darkness. "Last warning," I said, the authority in my voice undermined by its shaking. The drawer opened fully with a sudden jerk that made me flinch. Inside, illuminated by the neighboring desk lamp, was a case file I recognized immediately. The Westlake case, James's last investigation before his accident. The one he never solved. I lowered my gun slightly, confusion momentarily overriding fear. The file lifted from the drawer, not sliding, but rising, as if lifted by invisible hands. It hovered for a heartbeat before dropping onto the desk with a slap that echoed like a gunshot. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair, my gun now trained on a floating manila folder. My mind raced through explanations: wind, air currents, magnetic fields, sleep deprivation hallucinations. None fit. The file opened. Pages turned slowly, one by one, settling on a photograph of Thomas Westlake, the primary suspect in a series of disappearances that had preceded Emily Wright's by almost exactly 3 months. The suspect James had been pursuing the night his police cruiser went off Blackwater Bridge. A chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature ran down my spine. I couldn't look away from the photograph, from Westlake's eyes that seemed to stare back at me from the glossy paper. The precinct phone rang, shrill and sudden, making me jump. My eyes flicked to it, 3:22 a.m., who would be calling, and back to the desk. The file was closed. The drawer shut. Everything back in place. But on the dusty surface of James's desk, visible in the light from my desk lamp, was a single word written in the condensation. Connect. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. How could I? Ghost of my dead partner opened a cold case file wasn't exactly something you brought up at the morning briefing. Besides, by the time dawn broke and the precinct began to fill with the mundane sounds of coffee brewing and keyboards clicking, I nearly convinced myself it had been a stress-induced hallucination. Nearly. The word connect had vanished from James's desk by morning, evaporated with the condensation that had formed it. But the Westlake file was sitting on my desk when I returned from the bathroom, though I was certain I hadn't moved it there. I spent the day reviewing both cases, looking for the connection James wanted me to see. Emily Wright and the 3 women who had disappeared before her shared little in common. Different ages, occupations, social circles. The only connective thread was that all had vanished without a trace within a 30-mile radius. By evening, the precinct had emptied again. Captain Reynolds stuck his head in before leaving. "Harmon, go home. You look like hell." I nodded, not looking up from the files. "Just finishing up here." He hesitated in the doorway. "You're not James, you know. You don't have to carry every case like it's yours alone." The mention of James sent a jolt through me. I looked up sharply, searching the captain's face for, what? Some indication he knew about last night? But his expression showed only concern. "I'm fine, Captain. Just want to check something." After he left, I pulled out the county map, marking each disappearance. 4 points that formed almost a perfect square. The hairs on my arms stood up. How had we missed this? It wasn't random, it was methodical. Outside, the day had faded into a stormy evening. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The building creaked and settled around me. I needed to see the evidence from the Westlake investigation. James had been convinced Westlake was responsible for the first 3 disappearances, but we never found enough evidence to charge him. After James's accident, the case had gone cold. The evidence room was in the basement, accessible by a narrow stairwell at the end of the darkened hallway. I grabbed my flashlight, the stairwell lights had been temperamental lately, and headed down. Each step creaked beneath my weight. The air grew cooler as I descended, carrying the musty scent of old paper and concrete. At the bottom, I fumbled for the light switch, finding only a smooth wall where it should have been. I swept my flashlight across the wall. The switch was gone, as if it had never existed. "What the hell?" I muttered, directing my beam toward the evidence room door. The narrow corridor seemed longer than I remembered, the shadows between flashes of lightning deeper and more absolute. A noise behind me, the soft scuff of a shoe on concrete. I whirled around, heart pounding, flashlight beam cutting through darkness. Nothing but empty stairs. "Hello?" My voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. "Anyone there?" The building settled again with a groan. Just the storm, I told myself. The old building responding to changing pressure. I turned back toward the evidence room, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The flashlight beam flickered momentarily, darkness pressing in before the light stabilized. The evidence room key was cold on my palm as I approached the door. It felt heavier than usual, resistant as I slid it into the lock. The mechanism clicked, echoing in the silent corridor. The door swung open with a protesting creak, revealing rows of metal shelving units filled with labeled boxes. I stepped inside, playing my flashlight over the nearest shelves to orient myself. The Westlake evidence would be in Section F, where we kept active investigation materials. The door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, spinning around, my pulse racing. Through the small window in the door, the corridor was pitch black. The storm must have knocked out the power. I tried the handle, locked. From the outside. Impossible. The door couldn't lock automatically. It wasn't designed that way. I pounded on the door. Hey, anyone up there? Silence answered me, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. My flashlight flickered again, longer this time. I slapped it against my palm, and the beam strengthened momentarily before dimming to a sickly yellow glow. Something moved at the edge of my vision, between the shelving units. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, person-shaped. Who's there? I called, drawing my weapon. Identify yourself. The shadow didn't respond, but it seemed to elongate, stretching impossibly tall before disappearing behind a row of shelves. My flashlight died completely. In the perfect darkness, I heard the soft, systematic sound of boxes being opened. The rustle of papers. Someone, something, was searching the evidence. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight function. The weak blue-white glow illuminated only a few feet in front of me. Police officer. Show yourself. I moved cautiously between the shelves, gun extended, phone held awkwardly alongside it. The sounds had come from Section F. Each step felt like moving through molasses, my limbs heavy with dread. I reached the right shelf and swept my phone light across the boxes. The Westlake evidence container sat open, its contents disturbed. And beside it, impossibly, was a dripping wet pile of clothing. I recognized the jacket immediately, the same one James had been wearing the night his car went off the bridge. Water pooled on the concrete floor, spreading outward from the soaked garments. The temperature plummeted. My breath frosted in front of my face. The phone's light began to strobe, flashing erratically. Between flashes, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the row. Tall, James's height, but wrong somehow. Distorted. Water streamed from its form, its face obscured by shadows despite my light pointed directly at it. Flash. Empty space. Flash. The figure, closer now. Flash. Empty again. Flash. Closer still, arm extended, pointing. My back hit the shelves behind me. Boxes tumbled, spilling their contents. Cold water soaked into my shoes. Flash. The figure stood directly before me, its face finally visible. James's face, but pale, bloated, eyes black and empty. His mouth opened, wider than humanly possible. Connect. I didn't hear the word, I felt it, reverberating in my skull. The phone died. Total darkness enveloped me. Something cold and wet wrapped around my wrist. I screamed, firing blindly into the darkness. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating empty air where the figure had stood. The evidence room door flew open, fluorescent light from the corridor spilling in. Officer Parker stood in the doorway, wide-eyed. Detective Harmon? We heard a shot. The power came back on in. I staggered toward him, glancing back at Section F. The Westlake box was closed, intact. No wet clothes. No water on the floor. But clutched in my left hand was a soggy, water-damaged photograph I didn't remember picking up. A lakeside cabin I recognized immediately, Thomas Westlake's hunting property, the one place we'd never secured a warrant to search. And scrawled across the back in running ink, "They're still alive." I'm telling you, they could still be alive. My voice was too loud for Captain Reynolds' office, bouncing off the frosted glass walls. Outside, I could see other officers glancing our way before quickly averting their eyes. Reynolds massaged his temples. Based on a hunch? Or should I tell the DA we're reopening the case because a ghost told you to? I winced. News of my episode in the evidence room had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officer Parker's account of finding me alone, gun discharged, babbling about James had done nothing for my credibility. "I didn't say anything about a ghost," I said carefully. "But look at the pattern of disappearances. Look at Westlake's property in relation to where all 4 women vanished. It's the center point." Reynolds studied the map I'd placed on his desk, his expression softening slightly. "It's circumstantial at best, Harmon. We already looked at Westlake 3 months ago. Found nothing. We never got inside the cabin. The warrant only covered the main house and garage, because we had no probable cause for the cabin. We still don't." He leaned back in his chair, concern etching lines around his eyes. "When's the last time you slept? Really slept?" I ignored the question. "Just let me take another run at Westlake. One interview." Reynolds was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving my face. Finally, he sighed. "Fine. One interview. But you take Wilson with you." Detective Wilson was a 26-year-old transfer from Portland, eager and by the book. The babysitter assignment couldn't have been more obvious. I left Reynolds' office feeling the weight of eyes following me. The whispers had already started. Harmon's cracking up, just like his partner did before the accident. James hadn't cracked up. He'd been onto something. Something that got him killed, or whatever had happened to him that night on the bridge. I gathered my notes and headed to my desk. James's empty chair across from mine seemed to accuse me somehow, its stillness a reminder of my failure to see what he had seen 3 months ago. Wilson was waiting for me, jacket already on, keys in hand. Young, blonde, with the kind of earnest face that made witnesses want to talk. "Ready when you are, Detective Harmon." The drive to Westlake's property took 45 minutes, the last 15 on winding dirt roads through dense forest. The day was overcast, the cloud cover so low it seemed to brush the tops of the pines. The rain had stopped, but the world remained wet, colors saturated and dripping. "So," Wilson said, breaking the silence that had persisted for most of the journey, "you think Westlake is holding these women somewhere?" I kept my eyes on the road. "It's possible. Based on pattern recognition, instinct, the ghost of my dead partner," I didn't add. Wilson nodded, trying too hard to look thoughtful. "The captain says you and Detective Collins were close." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We were partners for 8 years. Must have been tough. What happened?" "The accident." There was a question in his words that he wasn't asking directly. I glanced at him. "You heard something else?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Just precinct talk. That he was acting strange before." obsessed with the Westlake case. Some people said that he was losing it. I finished for him. James was the most stable person I knew, the best detective in the county. If he was fixated on Westlake, he had a reason. Wilson fell silent as we pulled up to the gravel driveway leading to Westlake's main house. A well-maintained Victorian, white with green trim, surrounded by towering old-growth trees. Picturesque. Perfect for the rural veterinarian Westlake presented himself as. The cabin wasn't visible from here. It was another quarter-mile into the property, nestled against Blackwater Lake. The same lake that fed into the river where James's car had been found. Westlake met us on the porch as if he'd been expecting us. Tall, lean, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weathered good looks that aged well. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Detective Harmon. Back again? His gaze shifted to Wilson. And with a new partner, I see. My skin crawled at his casual reference to James's absence. Mr. Westlake, we have some follow-up questions about a missing persons case. Of course. He gestured toward the house. Come in. Though I'm not sure what else I can tell you that I haven't already. The interior was immaculate, tastefully decorated with antique furniture and hunting trophies. A massive elk head dominated the living room wall, glass eyes seeming to follow us as Westlake led us to a sitting area. Coffee, he offered. We both declined. I cut straight to the point. Emily Wright disappeared 2 weeks ago. Similar circumstances to the 3 women you were questioned about in January. Westlake's face showed perfect concern. I heard. Terrible business. But as I told you and your former partner, I had no connection to any of those women. You treated Melissa Caulfield's cat, I said. Jessica Torres volunteered at the same animal shelter where you offer free checkups. And Diane Foster's hiking group passed by your property the day she vanished. Westlake spread his hands. I'm the only veterinarian within 30 miles, detective. I treat half the pets in the county. And I volunteer because I care about animals. As for hikers, the trail runs along the edge of my land. Dozens of people pass by every week. And Emily Wright? Never met her. I studied his face, looking for any tell, any micro-expression that might betray deception. Nothing. Either he was innocent or an exceptional liar. Mr. Westlake, Wilson interjected, can you tell us your whereabouts on the night of March 14th? Home. Working on a manuscript. Westlake had published 2 well-received books on veterinary practice. I'm on deadline for my 3rd. Anyone who can verify that? I live alone, detective. I lean forward. We'd like to take a look at your cabin by the lake. Something flickered in Westlake's eyes, so brief I almost missed it. Surprise? Concern? It was gone before I could identify it. The cabin? It's not much to look at. Just a fishing spot. All the same, we'd appreciate a tour. Westlake's smile remained fixed. Do you have a warrant, Detective Harmon? We can get one. Then I suggest you do that. His tone remained pleasant, but had cooled considerably. Now, if there's nothing else, I have appointments this afternoon. After we were back in the car, Wilson looked at me. You really think he's hiding something in that cabin? I started the engine. I think he got very interested when I mentioned it. Instead of turning around, I drove further down the driveway, following it as it curved through the woods. Westlake stepped onto his porch, watching us. Harmon, what are you doing? We can't go to the cabin without a warrant, not after he explicitly denied permission. I stopped the car where the path forked, left continuing to circle back to the main road, right descending toward the lake, barely visible through the trees. We're not going to the cabin. Just getting oriented. Through the windshield, I could see a sliver of dark water and the edge of a wooden structure. The cabin sat low against the shoreline, weathered gray wood almost disappearing into the mist rising from the lake's surface. Something about this scene tugged at my memory. I'd seen it before, but not in person. In a photograph. In James's case file. Static burst from the car radio, though I hadn't turned it on. A high-pitched squeal that made both Wilson and me wince. I reached to switch it off, but before my hand touched the dial, the static resolved momentarily into a voice. Look under. The radio died. Wilson stared at it, then at me. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. My attention had fixed on something else, a glint of metal at the edge of the lake. Something reflecting what little sunlight penetrated the cloud cover. Without thinking, I opened the car door. Harmon, we can't. Just looking, I said, already walking down the path. Stay here if you want. I heard Wilson curse, then the sound of him following. The ground grew soggy as we approached the lake, each step releasing the scent of wet earth and decaying vegetation. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin. 50 yards from the cabin, I stopped, not wanting to risk trespassing charges that would invalidate anything we found. The metal I'd seen was part of a small dock, extending about 15 feet into the water. Attached to it was a rowboat, its wooden hull dark with moisture. We need to go, Wilson said, his hand on my arm. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets evidence thrown out. He was right. I knew he was right. But as I turned to leave, movement caught my eye, a curtain in the cabin window shifting, falling back into place. Someone was watching us. Back in the car, I sat for a moment without starting the engine, staring at the cabin through the trees. Wilson broke the silence. You want to tell me what's really going on here? I considered lying, offering some procedural explanation. But something in the young detective's face stopped me. Concern, yes, but also a willingness to listen. James was convinced Westlake was responsible for those disappearances, I said finally. The night he died, he'd been out here, watching the property. Without a warrant? That's off the books, yeah. He said he didn't have enough for a warrant yet, but he was close. Said he'd seen something. I gripped the steering wheel, remembering my last conversation with James. How agitated he'd been. The next morning, they found his car in the river, 2 miles downstream from here. Wilson was quiet for a long moment. You think Westlake had something to do with his death? I think James saw something he wasn't supposed to see. I started the car, turning around to head back to the main road. As we passed Westlake's house, he was still on the porch, watching. I raised a hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that said I'll be back. The radio burst to life again as we turned onto the highway, startling both of us. Through the crackling static, words formed, disjointed, distant, but unmistakable. Under, lake, look, under. Then silence, as if the voice had never been. Wilson's face had gone pale. That couldn't have been. I didn't need him to finish the thought. It had sounded exactly like James. We're not getting that warrant. Captain Reynolds' voice was final, his office door closed against potential eavesdroppers. Not based on a hunch and a malfunctioning car radio. I'd left out the part about James's ghost, of course. Even with that omission, my case was thin. For women missing, Captain. All connected to Westlake, however tangentially. And his cabin is perfectly situated, isolated, close to where James's car went off the road. Reynolds shook his head. It's not enough, and you know it. Every judge would laugh us out of chambers. He studied me, concern evident. Take some time off, Michael. You haven't been right since James died. He's not dead. The words escaped before I could stop them. Reynolds froze. Excuse me? They never found his body, I amended quickly. Just the car. After 3 months in that river, there wouldn't be much to find. Reynolds' voice softened. Listen, I miss him too. James was a good cop and a good man. But this isn't what you would want. You running yourself into the ground, risking your career. But it was exactly what James wanted. He made that clear, hadn't he? Connect. They're still alive. Look under. I left Reynolds' office knowing I was alone in this. Wilson had been sympathetic, but he wasn't about to risk his promising career on my ghost story. The rest of the precinct already thought I was coming apart at the seams. Night fell as I sat at my desk, surrounded by the files of all 4 missing women and everything we had on Thomas Westlake. Nothing we could use to secure a warrant. Nothing concrete connecting him to the disappearances. The precinct emptied around me, officers nodding goodbyes as they filed out. Soon, I was alone with the humming fluorescent lights and the gathering shadows. James's desk sat empty across from mine, as it had for 3 months. In those first weeks after the accident, I'd found myself talking to that empty space, asking questions as if James might answer. Now I knew he could. What am I missing? I asked the silence. What did you see that night? The air conditioner clicked on, stirring papers on my desk. For a moment, that was the only response. Then, the desk lamp above James's workspace flickered to life. Not the fluorescent overhead, but the small brass lamp he brought from home, the one with the green glass shade that no one had bothered to remove. It had been unplugged for months. I stared at it, heart hammering, as it blinked rhythmically. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS. The international distress signal. James? My voice was barely a whisper. Are you here? The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me. The lamp continued its urgent pattern, casting moving shadows across the walls. Water began to pool on the floor around James's desk, seeping from nowhere, spreading outward in a widening circle. It reached my shoes, ice cold, smelling of lake water and decay. The lamp went dark. In the sudden dimness, a figure coalesced in James's chair, a suggestion of a man, transparent but unmistakable. James Collins, or what remained of him, water streaming from his clothes, his hair, his pale skin. His eyes, when they fixed on mine, were black reflective pools. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Terror and grief paralyzed me as the apparition raised a dripping hand and pointed, not at me, but past me, toward the large county map on the wall behind my desk. I turned slowly, following the gesture. The map showed our jurisdiction, with Blackwater Lake prominent near the center. James had circled it in red months ago, when the first disappearance had been reported. The lake? I whispered, turning back. The chair was empty, the floor dry, the lamp unplugged. But on James's computer monitor, which had been dark for months, glowing green text appeared letter by letter. Not accident. Pushed. Saw cabin. Saw them. My blood ran cold. Westlake killed you? Underneath. The word appeared slowly, the letters seeming to drip like water down the screen. Under the lake? Under the cabin? I stepped closer, desperate to understand. The screen flickered, then displayed a new message. Going back tonight. Follow. The monitor went dark. The precinct fell silent once more, the temperature returning to normal so quickly my skin prickled with the change. I stood frozen, trying to process what I'd seen, what it meant. James hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered because he discovered where Westlake was keeping his victims. Somewhere under the cabin or under the lake itself. And tonight, James was going back. Wanted me to follow. To Blackwater Lake. To Westlake's property. Without a warrant. Without backup. Without sanction. I glanced at my watch. 10:47 p.m. Westlake would likely be asleep, or at least in the main house. If I was careful, I could approach the cabin from the lake side, stay on public water, avoid trespassing until I knew exactly what I was looking for. It was career suicide if I was caught. Worse if I was wrong. But 4 women might still be alive. And James, whatever remained of him, needed justice. I left the precinct and drove home, changing into dark clothes and waterproof boots. I packed a small waterproof bag with a flashlight, my service weapon, handcuffs, and my phone. Then I drove to the public boat launch at the south end of Blackwater Lake. The night was overcast, the moon and stars hidden behind a blanket of clouds. Perfect for what I had planned. I rented a small aluminum rowboat from the 24-hour automated kiosk, paying in cash, keeping my face turned away from the security camera. The lake was still, a black mirror reflecting nothing. Mist hovered just above the surface, ghostly tendrils reaching upward before dissolving. I rowed quietly, keeping close to the shoreline, oriented by the distant glow of Westlake's main house through the trees. It took 30 minutes to navigate to the area where his property met the water. I cut the small electric motor I'd been using and drifted the last 100 yards, silent as the mist itself. Westlake's cabin was dark, a black silhouette against the darker trees. The dock extended into the water like a skeletal finger, his rowboat tied alongside it. I guided my boat to the opposite side of the dock, securing it with a length of rope that allowed it to float freely without bumping against the structure. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic. Just the occasional lap of water against wood and aluminum. I climbed carefully onto the dock, wincing at every creak of the weathered planks. From this vantage point, I could see the cabin more clearly, small, single-story, with a covered porch facing the water. No lights visible inside or out. Underneath, James had written, "Under the cabin, under the dock, under the lake." I swept my flashlight across the water's surface, keeping the beam low and partially covered with my hand to minimize its visibility. Nothing but black water and swirling mist. I moved to the edge of the dock, crouching to examine its construction. The wooden pilings disappeared into the dark water, giving no clues. But as I shifted position, my light caught something, a glint of metal beneath the surface, maybe 10 feet out from the dock's end. I leaned further, focusing the beam. There was something down there, half buried in the lake bottom. something large and metallic. Without conscious decision, I found myself removing my jacket and shoes. The September night air was cold against my skin, promising that the water would be worse. I hesitated only briefly before slipping into the lake, the shock of cold driving the air from my lungs. I tread water, waiting for my body to adjust, then took a deep breath and dove. The darkness was absolute beneath the surface. I swept my waterproof flashlight back and forth, fighting panic as the beam illuminated nothing but disturbed silt and the occasional fish darting away from the unexpected intrusion. My lungs began to burn. I kicked upward, breaking the surface with a gasp that seemed thunderous in the quiet night. After several deep breaths, I dove again, adjusting my trajectory slightly. This time, my light found it, a dark rectangular shape embedded in the lake bottom. Too regular to be natural. Too large to be debris. Some kind of container or structure, mostly submerged in mud. I surfaced again, gulping air. The cold was becoming dangerous, my limbs already growing numb. One more attempt, then I'd have to retreat. The third dive took me directly to the object. My hands found metal, corroded but solid. A hatch of some kind, with a large wheel-like handle. I pulled, expecting resistance. It turned easily, as if recently used. The hatch lifted, revealing a black opening. Water began to rush in, creating a swirling current that tugged at me. I fought against it, kicking hard to escape its pull, barely making it back to the surface. I dragged myself onto the dock, shivering violently. What I'd found wasn't just a container, it was an entrance. A way into something beneath the lake. A splash behind me. I whirled, expecting to see Westlake, a weapon, my career, and possibly my life ending in a single moment. Nothing but disturbed water, settling in expanding ripples. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. "James?" I whispered, scanning the misty surface of the lake. The water remained still, but the air grew colder. The mist thickened, coalescing into a vaguely human shape at the end of the dock. Not solid enough to be called a figure, more an impression, a density in the fog that suggested James's height and build. It pointed down, toward the hatch I discovered, then stretched an arm toward the cabin. The message was clear, the missing women were down there, and Westlake was the key. I nodded, understanding. "I'll come back." With a warrant, with backup. The mist dispersed, swirling away across the black water. I gathered my belongings with shaking hands, my mind racing. What I'd found was enough, a hidden underwater entrance on Westlake's property, evidence of something concealed beneath the lake's surface. Combined with the pattern of disappearances and James's suspicious death, it might be enough to convince Reynolds, enough for a judge to grant a warrant. As I moved toward my boat, a light flicked on in the cabin. I froze, pressing myself against one of the dock's wooden pilings. The cabin door opened, spilling yellow light across the weathered porch boards. Thomas Westlake emerged, dressed but disheveled, as if he'd been sleeping in his clothes. He stood perfectly still, scanning the dock, the water, the surrounding shoreline. Had he heard me? See my flashlight? I held my breath, acutely aware of the vulnerability of my position. If he spotted me, there would be no explaining my presence on his property in the middle of the night, soaking wet and clearly trespassing. Westlake walked to the edge of the dock, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his leg. He crouched, examining something on the wooden planks. Water. My wet footprints. His head snapped up, gaze cutting through the darkness toward the trees along the shoreline. looking for an intruder who had already come and gone. He pulled something from his pocket, the metallic gleam of a cell phone. His thumb moved across its surface, dialing. I couldn't hear his words over the sudden pounding of my heart, but his urgency was evident. Minutes stretched like hours as I remained motionless, barely daring to breathe. Finally, Westlake returned to the cabin. The light went out, but I knew he was waiting, watching. I waited longer, 20 minutes by my watch, before easing silently into my boat and untying it from the dock. Using only the current and minimal paddle strokes, I guided the small craft away from Westlake's property, not daring to start the motor until I was well out of earshot. The journey back to the public launch seemed endless, every sound magnified in the still night, every shadow potentially hostile. By the time I loaded the boat onto the automated return rack, my clothes had dried stiffly against my skin, crusted with lake water. In my car, heater blasting, I called Captain Reynolds' personal number. He answered with the slurred voice of interrupted sleep. Reynolds. Sir, it's Harmon. I've found something at Westlake's property. We need a warrant, now. What the hell are you talking about? Do you know what time it is? I found an underwater hatch, sir. Some kind of entrance beneath the lake, right by Westlake's cabin. Recently used. Silence on the line, then, tell me you didn't trespass on his property, Harmon. I hesitated. I was on the lake, sir. Public water. Another silence, longer this time. Come to my house. Now. And so help me, if you're wasting my time with another ghost story. It's real, Captain. I saw it. I touched it. And I think Westlake knows someone found it. I drove through the empty streets to Reynolds' suburban home, adrenaline still coursing through my system. By the time I arrived, the captain was waiting on his front porch, hastily dressed, his face grim in the porch light. I showed him my still damp clothes, described exactly what I'd found, careful to omit any mention of James's ghost guiding me. Reynolds listened without interruption, his expression shifting from skepticism to reluctant consideration. If, and that's a big if, this pans out, we do it by the book, he said finally. No cowboy heroics, no lone wolf bullshit. You compromised potential evidence with your midnight swim party, but we might be able to salvage this if we move fast and clean. He reached for his phone. I'll call Judge Mercer. He owes me a favor, and he might sign a warrant on what we have. But Harmon, his eyes locked with mine. If this is another dead end, you're on administrative leave. Indefinite. Understood? I nodded, relief and apprehension warring within me. Yes, sir. Reynolds made the call, explaining the situation with careful precision, emphasizing the pattern of disappearances and the suspicious underwater structure. I could hear Judge Mercer's skeptical questions from where I stood. Finally, Reynolds hung up. He'll sign it. We're assembling a team, tactical, evidence response, dive unit. Meeting at the station in 40 minutes. He fixed me with a hard stare. And Harmon? If Westlake is involved, if he killed James and took those women, we do this right. By the book. So it sticks. No revenge play. Clear? Crystal, sir. But as I drove to the station, I knew that justice and revenge had become indistinguishable. For the missing women. For James. Whatever we found beneath Blackwater Lake, I would see this through to the end. The end that James had been guiding me toward all along. Dawn broke over Blackwater Lake in shades of gray, the sun struggling to penetrate the low-hanging clouds. Our convoy, 4 police cruisers, an evidence response van, and an ambulance approached Westlake's property from the main road, lights flashing but sirens silent. I sat in the passenger seat of Reynolds' vehicle, warrant in hand, tension coiling in my stomach like a spring wound too tight. The 48 hours since my discovery had been a blur of preparation, statements, and cautious hope. Judge Mercer's warrant covered both Westlake's main house and the cabin, plus any structures attached to or associated with the property, including those submerged or partially submerged in Blackwater Lake. Remember, Reynolds said as we turned onto Westlake's driveway, we're executing a search warrant in a missing persons investigation. We're not storming a terrorist cell. By the book. I nodded, though my hand rested on my service weapon. After what happened to James, I wasn't taking chances. Westlake's expression when he opened his door to find 6 officers on his porch was a careful blend of surprise and indignation. No fear, no guilt, nothing to betray what might lie beneath his lake. Thomas Westlake, Reynolds announced formally, we have a warrant to search these premises in connection with the disappearances of Melissa Caulfield, Jessica Torres, Diane Foster, and Emily Wright. Westlake accepted the document with steady hands, scanning it quickly. This is absurd. I've cooperated fully with your investigation. Then you won't mind continuing that cooperation, Reynolds replied evenly. Officers will escort you to the living room while we conduct our search. 2 uniformed officers stayed with Westlake while the rest of us spread through the property. I headed directly for the cabin, Wilson at my side, 2 tactical officers following. The path to the lake seemed different in daylight, less ominous, more mundane. The cabin, too, looked ordinary, weathered gray wood, simple construction, large windows facing the water. Nothing to suggest what might lie beneath the placid surface of the lake. Where exactly was this hatch? Wilson asked as we approached the dock. I pointed to the spot approximately 10 feet beyond the dock's end. There. The dive team should be here soon. As if on cue, a specialized van pulled up near the cabin. 3 divers emerged, already suited up except for their masks and tanks. While the dive team prepared, we searched the cabin. Single room, sparse furnishings, a bed, table, 2 chairs, a kitchenette area. Nothing immediately suspicious. Until Wilson opened what appeared to be a closet door. Harmon, he called, voice tight with tension. You need to see this. Inside what should have been a storage space was a small control panel mounted to the wall with a series of switches and a keypad. What the hell? I muttered, studying the setup. It looked military-grade, weatherproof, with heavy-duty wiring disappearing into the floor. Some kind of remote system, Wilson suggested. For controlling whatever's down there? Before I could respond, one of the tactical officers called from outside. Detectives. The dive team found something. We rushed back to the dock. 2 divers were already in the water, the third coordinating from shore. They had located the hatch almost immediately and were preparing to open it. No life signs on sonar, the coordinator reported, but there's definitely a large structure down there. Looks like some kind of sealed chamber or series of chambers. My heart raced. Can they get in? That's what they're attempting now. The mechanism is corroded but functional. Minutes stretched like hours as we watched the divers work beneath the surface, visible only as occasional air bubbles and disturbed water. Finally, one surfaced. We've got access, he reported, lifting his mask. There's an airlock system. Beyond that, a dry chamber. We need surface support to proceed. Reynolds, who had joined us from the main house, nodded grimly. Set it up. Full tactical entry once it's secure. The next hour passed in controlled chaos as equipment was assembled, plans formulated. Westlake remained in the main house under guard, still projecting calm indignation, still denying any knowledge of an underwater structure. When preparations were complete, I insisted on being part of the entry team. Reynolds hesitated, then agreed. But you followed tactical lead. Period. The dive team had secured the airlock system, allowing us to enter without scuba gear. 4 of us would go in first, 2 tactical officers, myself, and Wilson. Reynolds would coordinate from the surface. The descent was surreal. Down a metal ladder into what amounted to a submarine hatch, through an airlock chamber that cycled out water, then into a narrow corridor that stretched ahead into darkness. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing military surplus construction, reinforced walls, pressure seals, emergency lighting that flickered to life as we activated backup generators. Cold War era, one of the tactical officers murmured. Maybe an old government facility Westlake repurposed? The air was stale but breathable, heavy with the scent of metal and damp. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing through the corridor. We moved forward cautiously, checking each side passage, each closed door. Most contained only storage, preserved food, water, medical supplies, ammunition. A fallout shelter, maybe, or some doomsday prepper's dream. Then we found the first locked door, heavy steel with an electronic keypad similar to the one in the cabin. Breaching charge? Wilson suggested. I shook my head, studying the keypad. Let's try something first. I entered the date James had disappeared 3 months ago, almost to the day. The lock remained engaged. Worth a shot, Wilson said. I tried another combination, the date the first woman, Melissa Caulfield, had vanished. The light on the keypad turned green. The lock disengaged with an audible click. The tactical officers moved into position, weapons ready. One counted down silently, 3, 2, 1, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was clinically white, brightly lit, and divided into 4 glass-walled cells. And inside each cell, oh my God, Wilson breathed. 4 women. Alive. Each in a separate enclosure furnished with a bed, toilet, and sink. Hospital-like. Prison-like. They looked up at our entrance, expressions shifting from fear to desperate hope. Emily Wright, the kindergarten teacher who had disappeared 2 weeks ago, pressed her hands against the glass of her cell. Please, she mouthed, though no sound penetrated the barrier. Get medical down here, I ordered into my radio. We found them. All 4. Alive. While Wilson coordinated the medical response, I examined the control panel that evidently operated the cell doors. It required another code. I tried several combinations before the system accepted the current date. All 4 doors slid open simultaneously. The women emerged cautiously, disbelieving, clinging to each other. They were pale but appeared physically unharmed, though the psychological damage was evident in their haunted eyes. You're safe now, I assured them as medical personnel arrived. You're going home. Emily Wright grasped my arm. There were others, she whispered. Before us. He said we were the successful subjects. The others failed. My blood ran cold. Failed how? Where are they? She pointed to a door at the far end of the room. Through there. His specimen room, he called it. where he keeps his failures. I left the women in the care of medical staff and approached the indicated door with the tactical team. This one had no electronic lock, just a simple deadbolt. One of the officers forced it open. The stench hit us first, chemical preservatives masking something worse. As we entered, motion-activated lights revealed rows of glass tanks lining the walls. Each contained a body, or part of one, suspended in clear fluid. Some were recognizably human. Others had been modified. What the hell was he doing down here? Wilson choked out, turning away from the grotesque display. I moved deeper into the room, fighting nausea. At the center stood an operating table, surgical instruments laid out with meticulous precision. Beside it, a journal open to a page of handwritten notes. I pulled on gloves and lifted the journal, scanning the entries. He was experimenting on them, I said, or remounting as I turned pages. Trying to enhance them somehow. Make them able to survive underwater indefinitely. Human aquatic hybridization. Like mermaids? Wilson asked incredulously. Like weapons, I corrected, continuing to read. He was a military contractor before becoming a veterinarian, working on human augmentation for deep-sea operations. When the government shut the program down, he continued privately. I turned another page and froze. James's name leaped out at me. Detective Collins, Westlake had written, observed night diving activities. Containment protocol initiated. Subject eliminated. Body may prove useful for Phase 3 testing if recoverable. Rage swept through me, a white-hot tide that nearly consumed my professional detachment. James hadn't just been murdered, he'd been targeted for Westlake's twisted experiments. We completed our search, documenting everything for the prosecution that would surely follow. The facility extended further than we initially thought, living quarters, laboratory space, even a small submarine dock that provided an alternate entrance from the deepest part of the lake. 3 hours after our initial entry, we emerged into daylight with all 4 women. Westlake was already in custody, silent and defiant as officers placed him in a cruiser. He looked at me as they guided him into the vehicle, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over, Detective," he said, the first words he'd spoken since his arrest. "There are others like me. Others who understand what I was trying to achieve." "Save it for your confession," I replied coldly. As the cruiser pulled away, I stood on the shore of Blackwater Lake, watching ripples spread across its dark surface. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the answers to what had happened to James, his final moments, perhaps even his remains. "We'll drag the lake," Reynolds said, joining me. "Find him if he's down there." I nodded, though something told me they wouldn't find anything. James had already moved on, his purpose fulfilled, justice for his murder and for the women Westlake had taken now assured. A cool breeze swept across the water, stirring the surface into gentle waves. For just a moment, I thought I saw figures standing on the opposite shore, tall, familiar, raising a hand in farewell. Then it was gone, dissolving like mist in morning sunlight. "You okay?" Reynolds asked, following my gaze. "Yeah," I said, surprising myself by meaning it. "I think I am." 1 week later, I sat alone in the precinct, finishing paperwork on the Westlake case. The 4 women were recovering, physically unharmed but facing a long road of psychological healing. Westlake had been charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, 1 count of murder for James, and numerous other crimes as evidence continued to emerge from his underwater laboratory. The case had made national news, bringing attention to our small department and prompting investigations into Westlake's former military connections. There would be congressional hearings, task forces, a complete review of abandoned government facilities around the country. But for me, one piece of closure remained elusive. I looked up at James's empty desk, recently cleared of his personal effects, soon to be reassigned to a new detective. "We got him, partner," I said softly to the empty chair. "It's over." The precinct was quiet, most officers gone for the day. Outside, twilight gathered, shadows lengthening across the parking lot. The desk lamp on James's desk flickered once, a brief pulse of light though it remained unplugged. I smiled faintly. "I know. You can rest now." As I gathered my things to leave, I noticed something on my desk that hadn't been there before, a small puddle of water, perfectly circular. Not a coffee ring or condensation from a glass. Just water, as it dripped from above. I touched it with my fingertip, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage. It was real, cold against my skin. And beneath it, appearing as the water spread thin across the surface, words became visible on my desk calendar. "Thank you." By morning, both the water and the message had vanished, leaving no trace. Just like James himself, present only in memory and in the justice we had finally delivered. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the precinct, when I'm working late and the building settles into darkness around me, I sense him still, a watchful presence, a guardian at the edge of perception. And I know that some bonds transcend even death itself. Some ghosts never truly leave us. And some never should. The question rattled in my mind as I stood before the grand facade of the Orpheus Theater. Once the crown jewel of downtown, now a crumbling monument to forgotten glory. The marble columns were stained with decades of neglect, and ivy crawled up the walls like desperate fingers trying to pull the building back into the earth. My name is Marcus Webb, a freelance sound engineer with more student loans than clients. When I received an email offering $5,000 for a simple overnight acoustic assessment of the abandoned theater, I didn't question my good fortune. Perhaps I should have. "Just bring your recording equipment and document any ambient sounds throughout the night," the email had instructed. The city council needs this data before renovation decisions can be finalized. The theater had been closed for 23 years, following what locals cryptically referred to as the incident. No one spoke about it directly, but whispers mentioned a fire during the final performance, multiple casualties, and accusations of locked emergency exits. The official records had been sealed, and the building had remained untouched ever since, frozen in time like a mausoleum for memories. A cold October wind swept down the empty street, carrying the first few dead leaves of autumn. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, bleeding oranges and reds across the clouds. Perfect horror movie lighting, I thought with a nervous chuckle. I shifted the weight of my equipment bag and pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket. It turned in the lock with surprising ease, as if the door had been recently oiled. The hinges, however, groaned in protest as I pushed against the weathered wood. The lobby greeted me with that distinct smell unique to abandoned buildings, dust, decay, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Sweet and cloying, like perfume gone rancid. My footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each sound bouncing back at me from all directions. The acoustics were already fascinating. The space seemed to cup each noise like hands around a flickering flame. The grand chandelier hung motionless above, draped in cobwebs that looked like tattered wedding veils. Faded posters still clung to the walls, advertising the theater's final show, The Phantom's Last Bow, one night only. I set up my first audio recorder in the center of the lobby, calibrating it to capture even the faintest sounds. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the shadows gathering in the corners and to the balcony overlooking the entrance hall. Just an old building settling, I assured myself. All structures make noise as they expand and contract with temperature changes. That's science, not supernatural. The theater proper was accessed through towering double doors, their once red velvet upholstery now faded to the color of dry blood. They parted with a sound that reminded me of a pained sigh. The auditorium beyond was vast and dark, a cathedral dedicated to performance rather than prayer. The stage was still set for that final show, backdrops depicting a Parisian opera house, props scattered as if the actors had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. I shivered despite my jacket. The temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees since I entered. My breath fogged slightly in front of me as I made my way down the center aisle. The seats, hundreds of them, all faced the stage in perfect rows, like silent spectators waiting for a show that would never begin. I couldn't help but imagine them filled with ghostly audiences, their invisible eyes following my progress toward the stage. Setting up the main recording array took nearly an hour. I positioned microphones throughout the auditorium, focusing on areas where sound might behave unusually, beneath the balcony, beside the orchestra pit, near the stage wings. By the time I finished, night had fully claimed the world outside. Not that I could tell from in here, the theater had no windows, only emergency exits that had been chained shut decades ago. My only comfort was the distant hum of the city that occasionally penetrated the thick walls, a reminder that I wasn't completely cut off from civilization. I settled into a seat in the 10th row, supposedly the sweet spot for acoustic perfection, and powered up my laptop to monitor the incoming audio feeds. Everything was working perfectly. The software displayed gentle waves of ambient noise, the building's ancient heating system, the distant traffic, my own breathing. That's when I first noticed something odd. According to my equipment, the theater wasn't completely silent at all. There was a constant, barely perceptible hum at a frequency just at the edge of human hearing. I adjusted my headphones and closed my eyes to focus. It wasn't mechanical. It modulated slightly, rising and falling in a pattern that felt almost deliberate, like whispering without words. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the sound was coming from the direction of the stage. I opened my eyes and stared into the dimness. The abandoned set seemed different somehow, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The temperature dropped another few degrees, and my stomach tightened with the first real twinge of fear. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was exactly why I was here, to document unusual acoustic phenomena. Finding something unusual should have been exciting, not terrifying. Yet when the first distinct sound broke through the whisper hum, a single sharp tap like a fingernail against wood, coming from behind the curtain, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Tap. 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 A measured, patient rhythm. Like someone keeping time. Or counting down. My rational mind offered explanations, water dripping from a leaky pipe, a loose board expanding in the dark, maybe even a small animal moving around backstage. But then the tapping stopped, replaced by something worse, the unmistakable sound of fabric rustling, as if someone, or something, was moving behind the heavy curtains. And underneath it all, that constant hum continued, now rising slightly in pitch and intensity, like a chorus slowly finding its voice. I sat frozen in my seat, torn between scientific curiosity and primal fear, as the grand old theater around me seemed to draw a collective breath. The show, it seemed, was about to begin. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, expectant, like an indrawn breath before a scream. I remained frozen in my seat, heart hammering against my ribs, as I stared at the stage where nothing moved. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and fragile in the vast space, yet it echoed back at me from multiple directions, creating a disorienting chorus of my own uncertainty. No response came, but the ambient hum in my headphones subtly changed its character. If sound could be said to have texture, this shifted from something smooth to something jagged, with tiny variations that almost resembled syllables. I enhanced the audio feed, increasing the volume and adjusting the frequency range. There, buried beneath layers of static and room tone, were what sounded like distant voices engaged in overlapping conversations. Too faint to make out individual words, but unmistakably human in cadence. My scientific curiosity momentarily overcame my fear. This was exactly the kind of acoustic anomaly I'd been hired to document. I disconnected from the monitoring station and grabbed a handheld recorder, deciding to investigate the stage area directly. Each step down the aisle felt heavier than the last. The air grew noticeably colder as I approached the stage, my breath now clearly visible in wispy clouds before me. The temperature differential made no sense. Cold air should sink, not concentrate at stage level. I used the small flashlight on my keychain to illuminate my path as I climbed the side stairs to the stage. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, each sound unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. The stage itself was larger than it appeared from the audience. The floorboards were worn but solid, blackened in places by what might have been scorch marks. My flashlight beam caught dust motes dancing in the air, swirling in patterns that didn't match any air currents I could feel. "Just doing an acoustic assessment," I announced to the empty theater, trying to sound professional rather than afraid. Nothing to worry about. But there was plenty to worry about. Despite no detectable breeze, the edges of the backdrop curtains stirred slightly. The painted Parisian opera house scene seemed different from how I remembered it when I first entered. Were those additional figures now watching from the painted windows? Had that door in the backdrop been slightly ajar before? I held the recorder out, sweeping it slowly across the stage. Through my headphones, the whispering intensified near the center of the stage, where a trapdoor was outlined in the floorboards, likely once used for dramatic entrances or disappearances during performances. As I approached the trapdoor, my equipment suddenly erupted with feedback, a piercing shriek that tore through my headphones and made me cry out in pain as I yanked them from my ears. The sound cut off as suddenly as it had begun. When I cautiously replaced the headphones, the whispers had changed. They were clearer now, though still overlapping and disjointed. Trapped here forever. Couldn't escape when. Doors were chained. Smoke everywhere. Watching us from the balcony. I spun around to look at the balcony, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure leaning over the rail, just a darker shadow among shadows that seemed to recoil from my light. My hand trembled, causing the flashlight beam to dance erratically across the theater. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The whispers abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was total, even the background hum had disappeared. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than any noise could have been. Then something brushed against the back of my neck, light as a fingertip, cold as ice water. I whirled around, but there was nothing behind me. The rational explanations were evaporating quickly. No giraffe could feel so deliberately targeted, like a cold finger trailing down my spine. No natural acoustic phenomenon could produce voices that responded to questions. No temperature anomaly could create such localized cold spots that moved from place to place. I backed away from the trapdoor, nearly tripping over an object I hadn't noticed before, a single woman's shoe, vintage style, its once white fabric now yellowed with age. It lay on its side, as if it had been lost in a hurry. As my flashlight illuminated it, a sound rose from beneath the stage, a soft, mournful weeping that raised goosebumps along my arms. I should leave, I thought desperately. Pack up and go. Whatever they're paying me isn't worth this. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, kept me rooted there. What if this was real evidence of paranormal acoustic phenomena? My career would be made. Besides, the logical part of my brain argued, ghosts aren't real. There had to be a scientific explanation. I knelt beside the trapdoor, running my fingers along its edge. The wood felt unusually cold, almost damp. The outline was incomplete, no visible handle or mechanism to open it. The weeping grew louder, interspersed now with words I could almost make out. I pressed the recorder against the floor and cranked the volume to maximum. Help, please, we're still here. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The voice was clear as day, a young woman, terrified and pleading. Something creaked behind me. I turned to see the backdrop of the Parisian Opera House swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The painted door in its center now stood conspicuously open, revealing a darkness deeper than mere paint should be able to produce. As I watched, transfixed with horror, a hand emerged from that painted darkness, pale, slender, and horrifically real despite emerging from a two-dimensional backdrop. It beckoned once, fingers curling in invitation, before withdrawing back into the impossible darkness. I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the stage in my haste. My elbow struck something hard, a prop telephone from the set. It rang suddenly, an old-fashioned mechanical bell that shattered the silence like a gunshot. Against all better judgment, I picked up the receiver. "The performance isn't over," whispered a voice directly into my ear, intimate as a lover's secret. "You're needy for the final act." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. It continued to dangle from its cord, the receiver swinging gently back and forth like a hypnotist's watch. The weeping from beneath the stage had stopped. Instead, I became aware of a soft shuffling sound, footsteps moving across the auditorium behind me. Many footsteps, from multiple directions, all converging toward the stage where I stood paralyzed with fear. Yet when I turned to look, the theater seats remained empty. The footsteps continued nevertheless, growing closer. My equipment was registering impossible readings, sound waves that formed patterns I'd never seen before, frequencies shifting in ways that defied acoustic physics. The temperature continued to drop until I could see frost forming on the metal components of my recording equipment. And still the footsteps approached, invisible audiences returning to the theater. Coming for me. I finally broke from my trance and ran, abandoning the handheld recorder on the stage. I had to get to the exit, had to escape before. I stopped dead in my tracks at the edge of the stage. In the dim light filtering from my abandoned equipment, I could now see that the theater was no longer empty. Every seat in the first 5 rows was occupied. Not by people, not exactly. They were like negative impressions of human beings, areas where light bent wrong and air seemed thicker. Darker patches shaped like men in old-fashioned suits and women in evening gowns, all facing the stage expectantly. Waiting. The temperature had dropped so low that each panic breath sent clouds of vapor streaming from my mouth. My fingers were growing numb, my thoughts sluggish with cold and terror. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking. As one, The shadow audience raised their arms, pointing toward the backdrop with its impossible door. The door that was now creaking wider, revealing not the back of a canvas flat, but a corridor extending into impossible space. A corridor from which emerged the sound of orchestral instruments tuning up, accompanied by soft, anticipatory applause. The show, it seemed, still needed to go on, and they had finally found their missing performer. My lungs struggled for oxygen in the frigid air as I backed away from the shadow audience and their accusing, outstretched arms. The exit beckoned behind me, a distant rectangle of normalcy in this nightmare theater, but my body refused to turn away from the threat, instinct keeping my eyes fixed on the silhouettes filling the seats. They weren't moving, yet somehow they were closer now. The front row no longer at its proper distance, but somehow encroaching on the orchestra pit, darkness spilling over the edge like fog. The orchestra's tuning had become more insistent, discordant notes stretching and bending in ways that violated musical theory. Each screech of violin strings felt like nails scraping along my skull, each brass note vibrating painfully in my chest cavity. "This isn't real," I whispered, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my conviction. "This is some kind of hallucination. Bad air. Old buildings have toxins, mold spores, carbon monoxide." One of the shadow figures in the center of the front row slowly rose to its feet. Though it had no discernible face, I felt its attention fix on me with terrible intensity. It raised one arm, pointing not at the backdrop now, but directly at me. A voice emanated not from the figure, but from all around me, as if the theater itself were speaking. "The understudy takes the stage." The other figures began to rise, a rippling wave of darkness standing at attention. The applause started again, building from scattered appreciation to thunderous demand. Still, I could see nothing but shadow silhouettes, their hands moving in terrible synchronicity. My feet began to move of their own accord, carrying me not toward the exit but toward the center of the stage. I fought against it, muscles straining, but some invisible force pulled me forward step by unwilling step. "No," I gasped, digging my heels into the wooden floorboards. "I'm not part of this." "Everyone is part of the performance," came the chorus of whispers from everywhere and nowhere. "The theater remembers all who enter." I was now positioned directly above the trapdoor, its outline glowing faintly blue beneath my feet as if illuminated from below. The shadow audience had retaken their seats, patient now that I was in position. The air around me had become so cold that my skin burned with it, the insides of my nostrils stinging with each desperate breath. The orchestra reached a crescendo, then abruptly fell silent. In that silence, I heard the distinct sound of a match being struck. The smell hit me a moment later, sulfur, then smoke. Not stage smoke, but the acrid, choking fumes of genuine fire. Orange light flickered at the edges of my vision. I turned to see flames licking at the sides of the stage, following the velvet curtains in greedy vertical paths. Unlike the shadow audience, these flames looked horribly real. Panic surged through me. "Fire!" I shouted, breaking free from whatever force had held me in place. I lurched toward the theater's exit, only to find my path blocked by more shadow figures emerging from the wings. These were different. They wore the shapes of stagehands and performers in partial costume. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like puppets on tangled strings. They encircled me, hurrying me back toward the trapdoor at the center of the stage as the flames spread with impossible speed. Through the roar of the fire came voices, screams of panic and pain that echoed the terror in my own mind. "The exits are chained. We can't get out. Help us, for God's sake." The trapdoor beneath my feet swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. I teetered on the edge, staring down into absolute darkness. Hands pressed against my back, ice cold, solid despite belonging to the shadow figures, pushing me inexorably toward the pit. In desperation, I twisted away and ran toward the back of the stage, toward the painted backdrop with its impossible door. If they wanted me to go through it so badly, perhaps it was actually an escape route. The fire parted before me like a curtain, flames pulling back just enough to clear my path. Behind me, I heard the shadow audience applause grow frenzied, approving of this unexpected plot development. I reached the backdrop and, without giving myself time to reconsider, plunged through the painted door. The world inverted. Up became down, darkness became blinding light, and silence became cacophony. I fell, or perhaps rose, through space that bent around me like taffy. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of temporal dislocation. When reality reasserted itself, I stood in the same theater, but not the same theater I had entered hours earlier. This one was pristine, gleaming with polished wood and fresh paint. And it was full of people, real people in vintage clothing, their faces alight with anticipation as they watched the stage. Watched me. I stood frozen in the spotlight, wearing clothes that weren't mine, an elaborate costume of a bygone era. The orchestra pit below me was filled with musicians, their instruments poised as they awaited their cue. "What's happening?" I whispered. A woman in an elaborate gown stood beside me, her face partially obscured by an ornate mask. She tilted her head, confusion crossing her visible features. "You're not Richard," she said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of a trained stage performer. "Where is Richard?" "He's supposed to be the Phantom tonight." Before I could answer, she looked past me, her eyes widening in horror. I turned to follow her gaze. At the back of the theater, smoke was beginning to curl beneath the doors. Thin tendrils at first, then thicker plumes that billowed into the auditorium. "Not again," the woman whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, not again." Realization crashed over me with nauseating force. I hadn't escaped the past, I had fallen into it. This wasn't a hallucination or a supernatural replay. Somehow, impossibly, I was here on the night of the fire. The night when dozens of people had died because the emergency exits had been chained shut. The audience began to notice the smoke now, murmurs of concern rippling through the crowd. Someone shouted fire, and the murmurs transformed instantly into cries of alarm. People rose from their seats, moving toward the exits with increasing urgency. I watched in helpless horror, knowing what they would find, knowing that I was witnessing the beginning of a tragedy I could do nothing to prevent. Or could I? If this was real, if I had somehow slipped through time, perhaps I could change what happened. I could save them. I could save myself. I ran to the edge of the stage, shouting over the growing panic, "The main entrance. Everyone go to the main entrance. The side exits are blocked." Some turned at the sound of my voice, confusion crossing their faces at the anachronistic figure in Phantom's costume directing them with decidedly modern language and urgency. The smoke was thickening rapidly, flames now visible beneath the doors at the back of the auditorium. The orchestra had abandoned their instruments, musicians scrambling over one another to escape. I jumped down from the stage, pushing against the tide of panicking patrons to reach the nearest emergency exit. As I feared, the door was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. I yanked at it uselessly, then looked around for something to break it. A fire axe hung in a glass case nearby. I smashed the glass with my elbow, ignoring the pain as shards sliced my skin, and wrestled the axe free. "Stand back," I shouted to the people crowded against the door. I swung the axe at the chains, the impact reverberating painfully up my arms. Again and again I struck, until finally the links gave way. I threw the doors open, and cool night air rushed in. This way, I urged, directing people toward the newly opened escape route. They poured through the doorway, coughing and crying but alive. I moved to the next chained exit, and the next, breaking them open as quickly as I could while smoke filled my lungs and flames consumed the beautiful old theater. My costume caught fire at one point. I tore off the burning cloak and continued my work. Time became fluid, stretching and compressing around me. I couldn't tell how long I fought to free the trapped patrons. Eventually, the heat became unbearable, the smoke too thick to see through. I collapsed to my knees, lungs screaming for clean air, skin blistering from the heat. As consciousness faded, I felt hands grasping at me, pulling me not toward the exits but back toward the stage. Cold hands. Familiar hands. The shadow figures had found me even here, in the past. They dragged me across the burning floorboards, toward the center of the stage where the trapdoor waited, open like a hungry mouth. With my last conscious thought, I wondered if I had changed anything at all, or if I had simply become another player in a tragedy doomed to repeat itself forever. The darkness of the trapdoor swallowed me, and I fell through time once more. Consciousness returned in painful increments. First came sound, a steady electronic beeping. Then sensation, crisp sheets, an ache that seemed to permeate every cell in my body. Finally, there was light, harsh and white against my eyelids. I forced my eyes open to find myself in a hospital room. Sunlight streamed through half-drawn blinds, illuminating medical equipment surrounding the bed where I lay. My arms were bandaged, and 4 drip attached to my left hand, and an oxygen cannula rested beneath my nose. "He's awake," said a voice to my right. I turned my head with effort to see a nurse standing in the doorway. She approached, professional concern etched on her features as she checked my vital signs. "Where am I?" My voice emerged as a rasp, throat raw as if I had swallowed broken glass. "Memorial Hospital," she replied. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. Smoke inhalation, second-degree burns, and a concussion. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Webb." Memory flooded back in disjointed fragments, the theater, the shadow audience, the fire, my desperate attempt to save people who had died decades before I was born. None of it made sense. Had I hallucinated everything after some actual fire broke out in the abandoned theater? What happened? I asked. The nurse adjusted my 4 drip. "The fire department found you unconscious near an exit in the Orpheus Theater. The building was engulfed in flames." She paused, studying my face. "They said it looked like you'd broken open a chained emergency exit before you collapsed. You saved the firefighters' lives. They were trapped when their primary exit route was cut off by a structural collapse. So there had been a real fire. But what about the rest of it? The shadow figures, the time slip, the audience from the past? There's someone here who'd like to speak with you," the nurse continued. "A historian from the city's Preservation Society. She's been waiting since they brought you in. Do you feel up to having a visitor?" I nodded, wincing at the pain the movement caused. Minutes later, a woman in her 60s entered the room. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling fragile artifacts. "Mr. Webb," she said, taking the chair beside my bed. "I'm Eleanor Whitaker, curator of the Historical Society. I can't tell you how relieved I am to see you awake. You wanted to speak with me?" My mind still felt sluggish, struggling to separate reality from whatever nightmarish experience I had in the theater. Yes. She opened her portfolio and removed a plastic sleeve containing what looked like an old newspaper clipping. I believe you might help us solve a mystery that's haunted this city for over 20 years. She held up the sleeve so I could see the yellow newspaper. The headline read, "Tragedy at ORPHUS, 27 Perish in Theater Fire." Below was a black and white photograph of the theater engulfed in flames, dated 23 years earlier. What does this have to do with me? I asked, though a cold dread was already spreading through my chest. Eleanor removed another protective sleeve from her portfolio. This one contained a program from The Phantom's Last Bow, the final performance at the Orpheus. She pointed to a name in the cast list, Richard Thornton, listed as playing the title role. Richard Thornton never made it to the theater that night, she explained. His understudy, William Hayes, took his place at the last minute. Hayes was among those who perished in the fire. She looked at me intently. When the firefighters found you 3 days ago, you were wearing the remains of what appeared to be a costume, one that matches descriptions of the Phantom's costume from this production. My mouth went dry. That's impossible. The nurse removed a third item from her portfolio, a photograph protected behind archival plastic. It showed the cast of the production, posed on stage in full costume. She pointed to a figure in the back row. This is William Hayes. I stared at the photograph, ice forming in the pit of my stomach. The face looking back at me was my own. That's not possible, I whispered, though the evidence was undeniable. The man in the photograph had my features, my build, even the same slight asymmetry to his smile that I'd always been self-conscious about. Eleanor watched my reaction carefully. When they pulled you from the fire, you weren't just wearing remnants of a costume, Mr. Webb. You were carrying this. She produced a small charred object from her bag, a vintage pocket watch, its case warped by heat but still intact enough to reveal ornate engraving on the back, "To William, may you always find your light. RT." My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The moment I touched the metal, memories crashed through me, not my memories, but his. Williams. Standing in the wings, heart racing with nervous excitement at unexpectedly taking the lead role. The first wisps of smoke. The growing panic. And then, me. A stranger in his costume, appearing from nowhere, taking control as chaos erupted. The official death count from that night was 27, Eleanor said quietly. But 28 people were reported missing afterward. The mystery that's puzzled us for decades is that William Hayes' body was never found. Until now, I murmured. She leaned forward. Here's where it gets even stranger, Mr. Webb. 3 days ago, when the Orpheus caught fire again, firefighters reported something inexplicable. They said that when they arrived, several emergency exits had been broken open from the inside, exits that had been chained shut since the original fire. Multiple witnesses claimed they saw theatergoers in vintage clothing fleeing the building before they mysteriously vanished into the night. My head spun with implications. Are you saying that I changed what happened? I'm saying that 27 people died in that fire 23 years ago, Eleanor replied carefully. But according to the original police reports, it should have been 54. Somehow, half the audience escaped through exits that had previously been reported as chained shut. She met my eyes. And the fire inspector noted that the chains appeared to have been broken with an axe. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. So William Hayes never escaped the original fire. His consciousness, his soul, whatever you want to call it, remained trapped in that theater all these years, along with those of the other victims. Until you came along. Eleanor gently placed the photograph and watch on the bedside table. I don't pretend to understand what happened, Mr. Webb. But I think, somehow, you created a bridge between past and present. You changed history while still allowing it to remain true to itself. The time loop is broken, I said, remembering the shadow audience and their desperate need for the performance to continue. They can move on now. As if in response to my words, the lights in the hospital room flickered briefly, and a gentle breeze swept through the closed space, carrying the faint scent of grease paint and aged velvet. There's one more thing, Eleanor said, retrieving an envelope from her portfolio. This was found in the theater archives during the fire department's investigation. It's addressed to you. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed with age, but the ink that spelled out Marcus Webb was still clear and dark. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting elegant and precise. Marcus. By the time you read this, I will have lived a life you gave back to me. You were my face that night, and in doing so, you saved not just my life, but the lives of 26 others. The theater's ghosts no longer walk its halls. We have all moved on, thanks to you. The official story remains that 27 people died that night. History books will never tell of your intervention. But we know. We remember. I've lived these borrowed decades well, under a new name in a new city. I became an acoustic engineer, inspired by you. Funny how life echoes across time, isn't it? The loop is closed now. You've freed us all, including yourself. With eternal gratitude. William Hayes, 1958 to 2022. P.S. Check your bank account. I made sure your acoustic assessment was well compensated. $5,000 was never going to be enough for what you did. I let the letter fall to my lap, tears blurring my vision. Against all odds and logic, I had changed the past while preserving the present. William Hayes, the man whose face I wore, whose destiny I borrowed, had lived a full life in the shadows of history. Eleanor smiled gently. The old Orpheus is gone now, burned to its foundations. The city council is talking about building a memorial park in its place. She gathered her materials, preparing to leave. Some sounds, Mr. Webb, are meant to be heard even when they come from beyond the grave. Others, she paused at the door, or finally allowed their peace. After she left, I lay back against the hospital pillows, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. For the first time since entering the Orpheus Theater, the air around me felt light and unburdened. There were no whispers, no coldness, no sense of being watched. Only silence. A peaceful, living silence that held no echoes of the past, just the promise of a future I had somehow been granted permission to continue. And somewhere, beyond the veil that separates life from whatever comes after, I imagine the final curtain falling on a performance 23 years in the making. The drama had reached its conclusion. The stage was dark. The theater, at last, was truly silent. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.